Hello there and welcome to History for Lunatics. I'm so glad you're here tonight. Pull up something comfortable, maybe a blanket, maybe a cup of tea, maybe just the quiet corner of the room where you usually listen when the day is finished and the world has finally stopped asking things from you. Tonight we are not going to a trench at first. We are not beginning with mud, barbed wire, gas masks, artillery, or young men waiting under a grey European sky. We're going somewhere much quieter. Somewhere with polished floors, heavy doors, ticking clocks, leather chairs, and men speaking in low voices over papers that could move more money than most nations had ever seen. We're going to Wall Street. And not the Wall Street of flashing screens, instant trades, and numbers changing too fast for the human eye to follow. We're going to the Wall Street of 1914, when finance still had faces, when banks were built like temples, when reputation could be as valuable as gold, and when a single private banking house in New York could become so important to the survival of Britain and France that it began to look less like a business and more like a second government. Tonight's story is about how J.P. Morgan became the banker of World War I. But before we take one step farther, we need to be careful with the name because history has a way of turning names into statues and statues into shortcuts. The great John Pierpont Morgan, the old titan with the hard stare and the damaged nose, the man who reorganized railroads, rescued the United States Treasury in the 1890s, and seemed to carry American capitalism around in his coat pocket, was already dead when the guns of August began. He died in 1913, just 1 year before Europe tore itself open. So the man who became the central banker to the Allied war effort was not the old Pierpont himself, but his son, John Pierpont Morgan Jr., usually called Jack Morgan, and behind him the institution everyone still called the House of Morgan. That distinction matters. It matters because the story is not just about one man. It is about a name so powerful that it outlived the body that first made it famous. It is about a private firm that inherited not only capital, but trust, habit, influence, and fear. It is about what happens when a war becomes so large that governments cannot pay for it with taxes alone, cannot supply it through their own factories alone, cannot feed it with their own fields alone, and must turn across the ocean to a country that is still officially neutral and ask not only for money, but for organisation, credit, steel, wheat, explosives, horses, copper, ships, and time. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because it is easy to say war costs money. We say it casually, almost as a phrase we already understand. But World War I did not merely cost money. It consumed money in a way the world had never seen before. It ate through national budgets, gold reserves, private savings, tax systems, railway capacity, grain harvests, shipyards, coal mines, and human bodies. Every artillery shell fired in France had a financial history behind it. Someone had mined the metal, someone had refined it, someone had insured the cargo, someone had extended credit, someone had signed an order, someone had shipped it through waters where a German submarine might be waiting, someone had promised that payment would arrive later, and someone else had to believe that promise. That is where the House of Morgan enters the room. Not with a sword, not with a uniform, not with a speech from a balcony. It enters with ledgers, cables, contracts, loans, and a private network of trust stretching from New York to London to Paris. And here is the thing that makes this story so strange. At the beginning of the war, the United States was not supposed to choose a side. President Woodrow Wilson asked Americans to be neutral in thought as well as action, which is one of those phrases that sounds noble until you place it beside a purchase order for rifles, a cargo ship full of wheat, and a banker in New York arranging credit for Britain. The country said it was neutral, American industry said it was open for business, and the House of Morgan found itself standing at the narrow place where those two realities met. Now, before we go deeper, I want to ask you something simple. Where are you listening from tonight? Are you somewhere quiet with the lights turned low, Maybe half listening while you work or rest or try to drift towards sleep? Are you in a city where money moves around you invisibly all day long, through banks and apps and bills and accounts you hardly think about? Or are you somewhere far from Wall Street, where this whole world of bankers and bonds feels distant and almost unreal? I ask because one of the strange truths of this story is that the money of war never stays in the counting house. It begins in offices and ends in fields, factories, kitchens, ships, hospitals and graves. A loan written in New York could become bread in London, shells in France, wages in Pennsylvania, profits in Connecticut, suspicion in Congress, and debt that would shape politics long after the armistice. That is why this is not just a story about rich men moving paper. It is a story about how modern war tied the ordinary world to the financial world so tightly that no one could fully separate them again. If this kind of storytelling speaks to you, if you like history told slowly enough that you can actually feel the room around the facts, it would mean the world to me if you subscribed and gave this video a like. You do not have to do it right now. Do it when something in the story catches you, when a detail makes you pause, when the past suddenly feels less like a date in a textbook and more like a place people had to live through. And if you want to share where you are listening from tonight, or what time it is where you are, leave it in the comments. I genuinely like imagining all these different rooms, all these different people, connected for a while by the same old story. Now let us begin slowly, because the beginning of this story is quieter than people expect. In the summer of 1914, the House of Morgan was already one of the most powerful private financial institutions in the world. Its main office at 23 Wall Street stood directly across from the New York Stock Exchange, a building that did not need a sign to announce itself. People knew what it was. That was part of the point. Morgan Power did not advertise in the usual way. It rested on the idea that certain men could be trusted with enormous things because they had already handled enormous things before. The elder Morgan had built that reputation over decades. He had helped stabilize American finance during panics, forced railroad competitors into orderly agreements, assembled US steel, and acted at moments as if private capital had a duty to rescue public order when elected officials could not move quickly enough. Some people admired this, some feared it, some hated it. Many did all three at once. By 1914, the name Morgan meant access. It meant London would answer your cable. It meant investors would listen. It meant that when a government needed to borrow, the Morgan partners could place bonds with people who might otherwise keep their money safely at home. That kind of power did not appear suddenly because of the war. The war revealed how much of it was already there. Jack Morgan inherited this machine, but inheritance is not the same thing as ease. He was not his father, and everyone knew it. The elder Morgan had been physically imposing, abrupt, theatrical without trying to be theatrical, the kind of man whose silence could feel like a command. Jack was more restrained, more conventional, less terrifying. He lived under the shadow of a father whose reputation had become almost mythological while he was still alive. Imagine inheriting not only a bank, not only a fortune, but an expectation that you will somehow continue being a man history has already decided was singular. That was Jack Morgan's position as Europe moved toward war. He was expected to preserve the House of Morgan's authority at the exact moment when the world that authority depended upon was beginning to break apart. In late July and early August of 1914, the crisis that followed the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand became something much larger than a Balkan dispute. Austria-Hungary moved against Serbia. Russia mobilized. Germany declared war. France was drawn in. Britain entered after Germany violated Belgian neutrality. Within days, the great European powers were at war, and the financial system reacted almost like a living body struck by panic. Stock exchanges closed. Investors tried to sell securities and convert paper wealth into gold. Credit froze. Ships were delayed. Insurance rates climbed. Cables moved back and forth across the Atlantic with increasing urgency. New York, which had long lived partly in the shadow of London finance, suddenly found itself in a peculiar position. Europe needed American goods. Europe needed American credit. Europe needed a safe market beyond the battlefield. And the United States, still outside the war, had factories, farms, railroads, ports, and banks that could supply what the belligerents were desperate to buy. At first, this did not look inevitable. It looked like confusion. American businesses worried about unpaid European debts. Farmers wondered what would happen to exports. Bankers worried about gold shipments and exchange rates. The New York Stock Exchange closed for months to prevent a crash caused by desperate foreign selling of American securities. This is one of those details that helps us understand how fragile the opening of the war felt. We look backward and see a path, but they were living inside uncertainty. No one knew how long the war would last. Many people believed it might be over by Christmas. That phrase has become almost a symbol of tragic innocence, but it also shaped the early financial decisions of the war. If the fighting would be short, then emergency measures might be enough. If the fighting lasted years, then the entire world economy would have to be rearranged around it. The House of Morgan did not become the banker of the war in one dramatic meeting. There was no single candlelit moment when Britain handed Wall Street the keys to its survival. It happened by stages through need, habit, connection, and pressure. Britain already had a deep relationship with the Morgans through the firm's London branch, Morgan Grenfell. France had financial connections as well. The Allied governments needed American supplies, but buying those supplies in the United States required someone to coordinate orders, arrange payments, extend credit, and reassure American manufacturers that they would actually be paid. This sounds administrative, almost dull, until you think about the scale. Britain and France were not shopping for a few crates of equipment. They were trying to feed industrial war. They needed rifles, artillery shells, machine tools, locomotives, chemicals, uniforms, boots, barbed wire, medical supplies, meat, flour, horses, mules, copper wire, trucks, and endless amounts of steel. Every order had to compete with other orders. Every factory had limits. Every shipment needed transport. Every promise of future payment had to be believed by someone. A government could ask, but a banking house with deep American relationships could make the asking practical. That was the opening through which Morgan moved. In 1915, the British government appointed J.P. Morgan and Company as its sole purchasing agent in the United States, and France soon depended heavily on the same channel. That appointment changed the meaning of neutrality in everyday practice. Officially, the United States was not at war. Legally, American firms could trade with belligerents. In reality, the British naval blockade made it extremely difficult for Germany to buy in the American market, while Britain and France could do so on a massive scale. The result was a neutrality that looked balanced on paper and tilted sharply in practice. Morgan did not create that tilt alone, but the firm became one of its central mechanisms. Through Morgan, Allied purchasing in America became more organised, more credible, and much larger. The bank was not merely lending money. It was helping decide which factories received orders, how goods moved, how credit was structured, and how American production would be tied to Allied survival. I want to be very clear here because this is where the story can become too simple if we let it. Jack Morgan did not sit in a dark room deciding the fate of nations by himself. The war was too large for that, and the Allied governments had their own agencies, officials, diplomats, and military needs. American industry had its own ambitions. The Wilson administration had its own legal and political calculations. German submarines, British blockades, public opinion, immigrant communities, newspapers, and congressional critics all pushed against one another. But the House of Morgan stood in the middle of enough of these forces that people began to see it as something larger than an ordinary bank. To supporters, it was the institution that allowed the democracies of Britain and France to tap American abundance before America was ready to fight. To critics, it was a private interest dragging the United States toward war because its loans would be endangered if the Allies lost. Both views contain something important, and neither is complete by itself. That is what makes the story worth telling slowly. It is not a cartoon about greedy bankers, and it is not a patriotic fable about wise financiers saving civilization. It is a story about incentives, loyalties, fear, opportunity, and the disturbing fact that in a modern industrial war, finance can become a weapon even before a country fires a shot. Think of an artillery battery on the Western Front. The men firing the guns are soldiers, the shells are military objects. The battlefield is in France or Belgium, but follow the shell backward. The metal may lead you to an American mine or mill. The explosive may lead you to a chemical company. The machine that shaped it may have been financed by credit. The order may have passed through a purchasing agency tied to Morgan. The payment may rest on a loan placed with American investors. The ship carrying it may be insured through yet another financial arrangement. Suddenly, the trench is connected to Wall Street by a chain of decisions that most of the soldiers will never see. This is how modern war expands. It does not stay where the maps say it is. It reaches backward into offices, farms, rail yards, banks, and dinner tables. It asks everyone to contribute something, even people who believe they are still outside it. By the time the United States entered the war in 1917, the American economy had already been drawn deep into the Allied cause. The formal declaration came later than the financial entanglement. This is one reason the Morgan story matters so much. It shows us that a nation can be officially neutral, while its markets, credit, industries, and sympathies are already moving in one direction. That does not mean American entry into the war was caused only by bankers. It was not. German unrestricted submarine warfare, the Zimmermann telegram, Wilson's diplomacy, public outrage, and broader strategic concerns all mattered deeply. But Morgan's role helps us see the quieter preparation, the way money and material can create a path before politics admits that the path exists. And that path began before most Americans understood how long and brutal the war would become. There is something almost unsettling about picturing those first months from inside the Morgan offices. Outside, Wall Street moved with its usual urgency, though shaken by war news and market closures. Inside, men read cables from London and Paris, studied exchange rates, discussed shipments, weighed credit risks, and tried to understand whether this European catastrophe was a temporary emergency or the beginning of a new financial order. They were not looking at trenches yet in the way we see them now, through photographs and memorials and films. They were looking at obligations. They were looking at whether Britain could keep buying, whether France could keep paying, whether American investors would accept Allied bonds, whether the United States government would object, whether public opinion would turn against them, whether German victory would leave their loans stranded, and whether Allied victory would make the House of Morgan more powerful than ever. These are not soft questions. They are hard, practical, uncomfortable questions, and they were asked in rooms where no mud touched the carpet. Now let us step back one more time before we enter the machinery itself. The old J.P. Morgan had believed in order. That word is important. He believed markets could become destructive if left entirely to panic and rivalry. He believed powerful men had to impose structure when systems shook. Many Americans saw that belief as arrogance, and they were not wrong to worry about it. But it also explains why the House of Morgan was suited to the role it took on. War is disorder on a scale almost beyond comprehension, and the Allies needed order imposed on their access to American resources. They needed one channel where there had been too many competing demands. They needed credibility where manufacturers feared non-payment. They needed credit where gold was running out. They needed a private institution that could move faster than governments and speak the language of investors, shipping firms, insurers, and factories. Morgan could do that because Morgan had spent decades doing similar things in peacetime, only on a smaller and less deadly stage. Railroads, steel, government bonds, corporate reorganizations, panic rescues — these were the rehearsals. World War I was the terrible performance that followed. As we move into the story, keep one image in mind. Not a battlefield image yet. Picture instead a desk in New York in late 1914 or early 1915. On it are cables from London, requests from Paris, lists of supplies, figures for gold, shipping schedules, and letters from American manufacturers who understand that the war might make them rich if they can produce quickly enough. Somewhere nearby is the memory of the elder Morgan, recently gone but still present in the name on the door. Across the Atlantic, armies are digging into the ground. The quick war is becoming a long one. Governments are discovering that courage is not enough, that patriotism is not enough, that even empires need credit. And in that discovery, the House of Morgan begins to change from a great private bank into the financial hinge of the Allied war effort. To understand how that could happen, we have to go back before 1914, before the loans, before the purchasing contracts, before the accusations that Wall Street had bought itself a war. We have to meet the Morgan name when it was still being forged, when the father was alive, when American finance was rougher, more personal, more dangerous, and when the idea first took hold that one banking house could steady a nation simply because enough people believed it could. Before the House of Morgan could become the financial hinge of a world war, it first had to become the House of Morgan. That sounds obvious, almost too simple to say, but it matters more than it seems. A banking firm does not wake up one morning and find governments trusting it with hundreds of millions of dollars because its office is handsome or because its partners wear good suits. Trust on that scale is built slowly, transaction by transaction, crisis by crisis, rumour by rumour, until a name stops being merely a name and becomes a kind of instrument. By the time Europe went to war in 1914, the old John Pierpont Morgan was gone, but the instrument he had built was still there, polished, feared, envied, and ready for use. His son would sit in the office, his partners would send the cables, his firm would arrange the loans, but the reason Britain and France could even imagine leaning so heavily on a private bank in New York was because, for half a century before the guns began, J.P. Morgan had taught the financial world that when disorder became dangerous enough, the Morgan name meant control. Let us go back to the beginning, not to the grand marble rooms of Wall Street, but to a boy born in Hartford, Connecticut in 1837, into a family already moving upward through the world of trade and banking. John Pierpont Morgan was not born poor. That is important to say plainly. He did not climb from a dirt floor cabin with nothing but hunger and ambition. His father, Junius Spencer Morgan, was a banker with international connections, and those connections would matter enormously. The Morgan story is not the familiar American myth of a man inventing himself from nothing. It is something more specific and, in some ways, more revealing. It is the story of a man born with access, trained inside a transatlantic financial world, and then disciplined by his father until he learned to use that access with extraordinary force. Junius Morgan believed in caution, reputation, punctuality, and the old rules of credit. He believed a banker's word had to be stronger than paper. He believed trust was not a sentiment, but a form of capital. The younger Morgan absorbed those lessons so completely that later, when people tried to describe his power, they often came back to the same idea. It was not just that he had money. Plenty of men had money. It was that other men believed him. That belief was not warm or affectionate. Morgan was not beloved in the way a public hero might be beloved. He was respected, feared, resented, and consulted. There is a difference, and it is worth sitting with for a moment. In the world of high finance, affection is optional. Confidence is everything. If investors believed Morgan stood behind a bond issue, they were more likely to buy it. If foreign bankers believed Morgan had examined a company's books and accepted its future, they were more likely to extend credit. If frightened men in a panic believed Morgan had chosen a course of action, they might follow him even if they disliked him. This was the core of his power. He could make belief move, and once enough people believed that Morgan's judgment could steady a market, The belief itself became part of the machinery that steadied it. His education was not the education of a dreamy scholar. He studied in Boston, then in Switzerland and Germany, learning languages and absorbing the habits of European business culture. This mattered because 19th century finance was not purely national. Capital crossed the Atlantic long before soldiers did. British investors bought American railroad bonds. American companies depended on European confidence. A factory in Pennsylvania, a railroad across the Midwest, a gold shipment moving from New York to London, all of these could be connected by letters of credit, bills of exchange, and personal relationships between banking houses that had known one another for years. Morgan learned that world early. He learned that America might be young, loud, and expanding, but much of its growth still depended on whether older financial centres trusted it. London mattered, Paris mattered, Frankfurt mattered, and the banker who could stand between Europe's capital and America's appetite for development could make himself very powerful indeed. When Morgan began his career, the United States was still rough around the edges financially. Its railroads were expanding at a furious pace, often with more optimism than discipline. Its corporations were growing larger than the legal and political habits designed to govern them. Its markets could be volatile, emotional, and dangerously thin. The country had enormous resources, but its financial system was not yet the central banking system we know today. There was no Federal Reserve until 1913, the same year Morgan died. For most of his life, when panic came, there was no modern central bank ready to flood the system with liquidity, coordinate rescues, and reassure markets. There were banks, clearinghouses, private financiers, the Treasury, and a great deal of improvisation. That absence created room for men like Morgan. It also created danger. A country without a strong public lender of last resort can find itself depending on private authority at the exact moment when private authority becomes least accountable. The Civil War gave Morgan an early view of money under pressure, though his own role during that conflict would later become a source of criticism. Like many wealthy men of his time, he avoided military service by paying for a substitute, a legal practice then, but one that never sounds noble when spoken aloud. During the war, he was involved in a controversial transaction involving the sale of rifles to the Union Army, weapons that had been purchased and resold at a profit. The details have been debated, and Morgan was not the only man of business to profit from wartime confusion. But the episode stuck because it seemed to reveal something critics would say about him for the rest of his life, that he understood crisis not only as danger, but as opportunity. That is one of those accusations that can be both unfair in tone and not entirely false in substance. Morgan did not create the age he lived in. He did, however, know how to move inside it. After the war, the United States entered one of the most explosive periods of industrial growth in modern history. Railroads spread across the continent, steel mills grew, telegraph lines stitched markets together, cities swelled. Fortunes rose with a speed that startled even the people making them. But growth brought chaos. Railroads competed destructively, building lines before traffic justified them, cutting rates to ruin one another, issuing securities on hopes that outran reality. Investors bought promises, managers hid weaknesses, speculators fed on rumour. Ordinary people, far from the counting rooms, felt the consequences when companies collapsed, wages were cut, and savings vanished. To Morgan, this kind of disorder was intolerable. Not because he objected to power, and not because he was a champion of small men being crushed. He was not that. He objected to wasteful competition, unstable finance, and reckless management, because they threatened the system in which he believed and from which he profited. His answer was reorganization. This is where the word Morganization enters the story. It sounds almost like a joke now, but it describes something very real. When a railroad was failing or tearing itself apart through competition, Morgan and his partners would step in, restructure its debts, replace or discipline its management, rationalize its operations, and often bring rival lines into agreements that reduced competition. To supporters, this saved essential companies from ruin and brought order to chaos. To critics, it looked like private dictatorship over the arteries of the American economy. Both descriptions are useful. Morgan did bring order, but it was order imposed from above by bankers and directors, not by workers, farmers, passengers, or voters. He believed that the men who understood capital should manage capital, and he had very little patience for the idea that democracy should interfere too much with finance. That belief would make him effective. It would also make him a symbol of everything many Americans feared about concentrated wealth. I want you to picture one of those railroad reorganizations not as a clean diagram in a textbook, but as a room full of tired men who do not trust each other. Railroad presidents, bondholders, lawyers, bankers, men whose companies owe too much and earn too little, men who have been fighting over rates and routes, men who know that if they all keep grabbing for advantage, the whole structure may collapse beneath them. Into that room comes Morgan, broad, heavy, impatient, with a gaze people remembered for the rest of their lives. He does not ask them to become friends. He does not ask them to be generous. He forces a settlement because the alternative is panic. He cuts through argument by making clear that his support, and the capital behind it, will go only to those who accept discipline. That was his gift and his danger. He made men behave when the market alone had failed to do so, but the behaviour he demanded served a system whose benefits were distributed very unevenly. There was also the matter of his presence. It may seem too personal, almost too small to mention a man's face, but with Morgan it became part of the legend. He suffered from a severe skin condition, often identified as rhinophyma, that enlarged and reddened his nose. In photographs his expression can look severe, almost carved. He disliked being photographed and sometimes had images retouched. People who met him often wrote about his eyes, his silence, his sudden anger, his ability to dominate without lengthy explanation. This is not just gossip. In the 19th century world of private banking, personality mattered. Decisions were made face to face. Trust was often personal. A man's manner could affect markets if enough people believed his judgment had force behind it. Morgan turned his own physical presence, intentionally or not, into part of the institution. The office, the partners, the art collection, the library, the ships, the clubs, the dining rooms, the quiet access to presidents and foreign bankers, all of it belonged to the same performance of authority. And yet Morgan was not merely a brute force financier. He had taste, discipline, and a collector's hunger for permanence. He bought manuscripts, paintings, rare books, religious objects, and works of art on a scale that seems almost imperial. His library in New York became a monument to acquisition, but also to the older world he admired. He liked hierarchy. He liked continuity. He liked the idea that civilization rested on institutions, and he seemed to see himself as one of the men responsible for preserving them. This matters because when we reach World War I, the House of Morgan's sympathy for Britain and France does not come only from calculations of profit. It also grows out of culture, relationships, and instinct. Morgan's world was transatlantic. Its manners were closer to London clubs and European banking houses than to prairie populism. The old Morgan did not live to choose sides in 1914, but the house he built already knew where its friendships lay. One of the clearest examples of Morgan's public power came during the gold crisis of 1895. The United States Treasury's gold reserves were dangerously low, and confidence in the government's ability to maintain the gold standard was wavering. This was not an abstract concern for investors. The value of money itself seemed to be at stake. President Grover Cleveland's administration turned, awkwardly and controversially, to J.P. Morgan and a syndicate of bankers to arrange a private sale of government bonds in exchange for gold. Morgan used his connections, including European ones, to help replenish the Treasury's reserves. To some observers, he had rescued the nation's credit. To others, the episode was humiliating proof that the federal government had become dependent on Wall Street. Imagine the discomfort of that image. A democratic republic, proud and expanding, forced to sit across from a private banker and ask for help defending its own money. Morgan did not invent that weakness, but he benefited from being the man who could answer it. The public anger that followed was real. Farmers, workers, and reformers already suspicious of Eastern finance saw Morgan as the face of a system rigged against them. They asked why a private banker should profit from a national emergency. They asked why decisions affecting millions were made in private rooms. They asked whether the country was becoming less a republic than an arrangement among bankers, railroads, and trusts. These questions did not go away. They grew louder as the 1890s gave way to the Progressive Era, and that tension between Morgan as rescuer and Morgan as unelected ruler would follow his firm into the war years. When critics later accused the House of Morgan of pulling America toward the Allies, they were not inventing suspicion from nothing. They were drawing on decades of anxiety about Morgan power. Then came 1901 and the creation of U.S. Steel, one of the great financial events of the age. Morgan helped assemble Andrew Carnegie's steel empire and other companies into the United States Steel Corporation, the first billion-dollar corporation in American history. Think about that number not as a statistic, but as a shock. A billion-dollar company at a time when many Americans still lived without electricity, when wages were modest, when a farm family might measure security in livestock and tools. U.S. Steel seemed to confirm that a new scale of corporate power had arrived, and that Morgan stood at its centre. Supporters argued that such combinations brought stability, efficiency, and the capital needed for modern industry. Critics saw monopoly, political influence, and the quiet crushing of competition. Again, Morgan's answer to disorder was consolidation. His answer to instability was concentration. His answer to chaos was control. That same pattern appeared during the Panic of 1907, perhaps the most famous moment of Morgan's career. By then he was an old man, but still the one people turned to when fear ran through the financial system. The panic began with failed speculation and spread through trust companies, banks, and markets. Depositors rushed to withdraw money. Institutions trembled. Credit tightened. The stock market plunged. In a modern financial crisis, we expect central bankers and treasury officials to appear before cameras, announce emergency measures, and open facilities with names so technical that ordinary people hardly know what they mean. In 1907, the centre of gravity shifted to Morgan's library. There, behind closed doors, he gathered bankers, examined books, decided which institutions were solvent enough to save and which were not, and pressured other financiers to contribute to rescue efforts. At one point, according to the famous story, he effectively locked bankers in a room until they agreed to a plan. Whether every detail of that story has been polished by repetition hardly matters. People believed it because it fit the man. There is a scene from that panic that feels almost too symbolic. Morgan, old and exhausted, sitting amid books and art, while men waited for his judgment as if he were a private court of last appeal. Outside, the public did not know exactly what was being decided, only that markets were in danger and that Morgan was involved. Inside, choices were made that affected banks, businesses, and the national economy. He helped stop the panic. That is true. He also demonstrated beyond any doubt that the United States had allowed private finance to become a substitute for public financial machinery. The lesson many reformers drew was not that Morgan should be thanked and left alone. It was that no republic should have to depend on one old banker's library to survive a panic. The creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913 grew partly out of that realization. The nation needed a central bank because the Morgan solution, however effective in the moment, was too personal, too private, and too dangerous to remain the only answer. By the time Congress investigated the so-called money trust, Through the Pujo Committee in 1912 and 1913, Morgan had become more than a banker. He had become a national question. How much influence did he and his partners have over banks, insurance companies, railroads, industrial corporations, and securities markets? How many directorates connected the same small circle of men to the commanding heights of American business? Was this coordination efficient, or was it control hiding behind respectability? Morgan appeared before the committee near the end of his life, and one exchange became famous. Asked about the basis of commercial credit, Morgan insisted that character came before money or property. A man he did not trust could not get money from him on all the bonds in Christendom, he said in substance. A man he trusted could get it without collateral. That sounds almost noble at first, and in a limited sense it is. It speaks to an older banking world where personal honour mattered. But there is another side to it. If credit depends on the judgment of a few powerful men deciding whose character counts, then finance becomes a gate guarded by private opinion. The same principle that made Morgan's word valuable also made his power unsettling. He died in Rome in March 1913, worn down by age, illness, public criticism, and the strain of a life spent at the centre of conflict. His death came just before the Federal Reserve Act was signed, just before the old private system began yielding to a new public structure, and just before Europe's war would test every financial habit the 19th century had created. There is something almost eerie about the timing. Morgan exits, the central bank enters, and then the world catches fire. But institutions do not die when their founders do. The House of Morgan remained, its partners remained, its London relationships remained, its habits remained, its reputation, built through gold rescues, railroad reorganisations, industrial combinations and panic rooms, remained. And his son, Jack Morgan, inherited not only wealth and authority, but the expectations attached to that authority. Jack Morgan is sometimes treated as a smaller man because he was not his father, and in certain ways he was. He lacked the old man's terrifying personal force. He did not dominate the age with the same almost theatrical certainty. But it is easy to forget how difficult his inheritance was. He stepped into leadership at a moment when public suspicion of concentrated finance was intense, when progressive reform had placed men like Morgan under a harsh light, and when the new Federal Reserve was beginning to alter the relationship between private bankers and national stability. Then Europe went to war, and suddenly the old Morgan network became useful in a way no committee hearing could erase. Britain did not need Jack to be his father in personality. It needed the House to be what his father had made it: credible, connected, discreet, and capable of organising money at scale. This is the part of the story where the dead man's influence becomes almost visible. The elder Morgan had spent his life binding American finance to European capital, especially British capital. He had spent his life making the name Morgan mean reliability to London. He had spent his life proving that private bankers could impose order when governments hesitated. He had spent his life building a firm whose partners understood that money was not just money, but information, timing, confidence, and pressure. When the war began, all of that could be turned toward Allied needs. The same transatlantic trust that once financed railroads could now finance rifles and wheat. The same reputation that once reassured bondholders could now reassure manufacturers waiting to be paid by foreign governments. The same habit of coordinating large systems could now coordinate purchases on a scale that would have stunned even the railroad men of the 1880s. But we should not rush past the moral discomfort. Morgan power did not become harmless because it served Britain and France. The old questions remained. Who elected these men? Who gave them the right to shape the flow of credit between neutral America and warring Europe? If the Allies borrowed hundreds of millions through Morgan, and if American investors bought those bonds, did that make neutrality less real? If American factories expanded to fill Allied orders arranged through Morgan channels, did that create a material interest in Allied victory? If a private bank became deeply tied to one side's survival, could the country around it remain honestly detached? These questions did not appear only after the fact. People asked them at the time. German Americans asked them. Populists asked them. Progressives asked them. Senators asked them. The answers were never simple, because the law of neutrality, the practice of trade, the pull of profit, and the sympathies of culture all pointed in different directions. I want you to imagine an ordinary American hearing the name Morgan in 1915. Perhaps he's a farmer in the Midwest, selling wheat at higher prices because Europe is hungry. Perhaps he's a machinist in Bridgeport, working longer hours because war orders have filled the factory. Perhaps he's a German immigrant reading a newspaper that insists Wall Street has chosen Britain before the nation has. Perhaps he's a small investor being offered Allied bonds, told they are sound, told that the House of Morgan stands behind the arrangement. To each of these people, Morgan means something slightly different. Opportunity, suspicion, security, arrogance, patriotism, profit. None of these meanings cancels the others. That is why the name had become so powerful. It could carry contradiction and still move markets. The old Morgan had believed that civilization depended on men of character managing disorder. But World War I would expose the limits of that belief. The disorder now was not a railroad rate war or a trust company panic. It was millions of men mobilized, empires blockading one another, submarines attacking shipping, governments spending beyond anything peacetime finance had prepared for. No private banker, however respected, could control that. Yet private bankers could still shape the channels through which the disorder was fed. They could decide how credit was organized, how risk was distributed, how supplies were purchased, and how investors were persuaded. They could not command armies, but they could help armies keep moving. In an industrial war, that was a form of power. There is a small irony here that deserves attention. The Federal Reserve was created partly so the United States would no longer depend on private giants like Morgan in moments of crisis. Yet almost immediately after its creation, the war gave the House of Morgan a new arena in which private financial authority mattered enormously. The old domestic role of rescuer had been reduced, at least in theory, by public banking reform. But the international role, the role of connecting American capital and goods to foreign governments, remained wide open. The state had built a new machine, but the old machine still had uses. And in the first years of the war, before America entered formally, the old machine moved faster and more naturally than the public one. By 1914 then, the House of Morgan was ready in the way an institution can be ready, without knowing what it is ready for. It had the London connection. It had the French connection. It had relationships with American manufacturers and investors. It had experience placing large loans. It had partners trained to think internationally. It had a reputation for seriousness and discretion. It had critics who distrusted it and clients who depended on it. It had the memory of an old man whose life had taught governments that, embarrassing or not, sometimes the quickest way to reach money was to go through Morgan. So when Britain and France discovered that the war would not be over by Christmas, when their purchases in America grew from urgent to enormous, when gold alone would not be enough and credit had to be arranged, they did not look across the Atlantic and see a blank field of possibilities. They saw a familiar door at 23 Wall Street, and that door matters. Behind it was not simply greed, though greed was present in the age, as it is present in every age where large profits can be made. Behind it was not simply patriotism for the Allied cause, though many Morgan partners felt culturally and emotionally closer to Britain and France than to Germany. Behind it was not simply financial genius, though the firm had real expertise. Behind it was a legacy built by the old man of Wall Street before the guns began, a legacy of imposing order, concentrating power, and convincing frightened people that the safest thing to do was to trust Morgan. The war would take that legacy and stretch it across the Atlantic until it touched nearly every part of the Allied supply chain. It would turn reputation into credit credit into contracts, contracts into cargo, and cargo into the material life of armies. And the first sign of how large that transformation would become came when Europe's gold began to move, when ships crossed the ocean carrying metal, securities, and desperation, and when neutral America started to discover that the war was already entering its banks long before its soldiers entered the trenches. The first sign that the war would reach America did not come as a marching army, or a naval squadron off the coast, or a formal demand placed on the president's desk. It came through markets. It came through cables. It came through men standing in financial offices with newspapers folded under their arms, trying to understand whether the numbers they had trusted yesterday still meant anything today. The summer of 1914 had already been unsettled by the assassination in Sarajevo, but most Americans had no reason to believe that a shooting in a Balkan city would reach into a bank account in New York, or a grain elevator in Kansas, or a cotton warehouse in New Orleans. That is one of the things history does again and again. It begins in a place that feels far away, with names that seem to belong to diplomats and kings, and then suddenly it is standing in the doorway of ordinary life asking for payment. By late July, the crisis in Europe was moving faster than most people could think. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Russia began to mobilise. Germany moved against Russia and then France. Britain entered after Germany invaded Belgium. Within days, the carefully wired financial system of the Atlantic world began to jerk and strain like a machine whose gears had been forced out of alignment. Investors did what frightened investors have always done. They tried to get liquid. They tried to sell what could be sold, collect what could be collected, and move their wealth into the one form that seemed safest when governments were mobilizing armies and borders were closing. Gold. Not confidence, not promises, not shares in railroads or bonds from a company whose future suddenly depended on whether ships could cross the ocean. Gold. The old metal. Heavy, awkward, limited, and, in moments of panic, psychologically irresistible. Now, to understand why this mattered so much, we have to remember something that is easy to forget from inside our modern world of electronic payments and central bank statements. In 1914, gold was not just a symbol of wealth, it was part of the operating machinery of international finance. Major currencies were tied to gold. International debts could ultimately be settled in gold. A nation's reserves mattered because they supported confidence in its money and its ability to pay. When people feared that paper claims might fail, they wanted the metal underneath the paper. That desire could become dangerous very quickly. If everyone wants gold at once, banks can fail. If gold leaves a country too quickly, confidence can collapse. If confidence collapses, credit freezes. And if credit freezes at the beginning of a war, then factories, railroads, shipping companies, exporters, importers, and governments all discover how dependent they are on trust that cannot be manufactured overnight. The New York Stock Exchange closed on July 31st, 1914, and it stayed closed for ordinary trading for months. That fact can sound technical, almost dry, unless you stop and picture what it meant. The great marketplace of American securities simply shut its doors because the pressure from Europe was too dangerous. European investors held large amounts of American securities, especially railroad stocks and bonds. If they dumped those securities in a panic to raise gold, prices could collapse. American credit could be damaged, and gold could flow out of the United States in alarming quantities. Closing the exchange was like throwing a heavy door across a crowded hallway to stop a stampede. It did not solve the underlying fear. It simply prevented fear from moving at full speed. For a country that liked to think of itself as energetic, open, and commercially free, this was a sobering thing. War had begun in Europe, and one of America's most important financial institutions had responded by stopping. There is something almost modern in that moment, because we know what it feels like when systems that usually run invisibly suddenly become visible by breaking. Most people do not think about payment networks until a card does not work. They do not think about supply chains until shelves are empty. They do not think about credit until it is refused. In the same way, many Americans did not think much about the fragile structure connecting European investors, American securities, gold reserves, shipping routes, and foreign exchange rates until war put pressure on every joint at once. Then suddenly the invisible became visible. Men who had spent their lives assuming bills would be honoured, ships would sail, exchanges would quote prices, and banks would convert claims found themselves staring at a world where every assumption needed to be checked. Foreign exchange became one of the first great problems. In ordinary times, a merchant buying goods from abroad did not need to load coins into a trunk and send them across the ocean. Payments moved through bills of exchange, credits, banking relationships, and balances between financial centres. London was at the heart of that system. Sterling bills were trusted around the world. London banks and discount houses made global trade easier because so many people accepted London's paper. But when war came, the smooth working of that system was interrupted. Ships were delayed. Insurance became more expensive. Cables carried urgent instructions. Debts came due while payments were uncertain. Exchange rates swung sharply because everyone was trying to settle obligations under conditions that had changed almost overnight. The United States had exported goods to Europe, borrowed from Europe, sold securities to Europe, and depended heavily on European financial markets. Now, Europe was mobilizing millions of men, closing or restricting markets, and hoarding resources for survival. At first, gold moved out of America. European holders of American securities and claims wanted settlement, and gold shipments were demanded. This frightened American bankers and officials because the United States was still part of a gold-based world. If too much gold left too quickly, it could weaken confidence at home. Banks and clearinghouses had to act cautiously. Emergency measures were discussed. The Treasury became involved. Bankers coordinated with officials. The new Federal Reserve System had been created by law in 1913, but it was not yet fully operating in the way it later would. It had not yet become the familiar central institution people would look to in every crisis. So once again, just as in earlier American panics, private bankers and public officials had to improvise. The old habits had not disappeared simply because a new law had been passed. The country was between financial worlds, and the timing could hardly have been more delicate. The House of Morgan was watching all of this with particular attention because its business rested on the very channels now under stress. It knew London. It knew how European capital moved. It knew American securities. It knew the habits of investors on both sides of the Atlantic. It also knew something many Americans outside finance were only beginning to understand. A European war would not necessarily make America poorer. Not if America could stabilize its own financial system. Not if the ships could sail. Not if Britain controlled the sea. Not if France and Britain had the ability to buy. Under those conditions, the United States could become a supplier on a staggering scale. The early panic, if survived, might give way to an extraordinary boom. That is not a pleasant sentence, but it is an honest one. War destroys wealth in one place and creates profits in another. The same shell that empties a treasury can fill an order book. The same hunger that frightens a city under blockade can raise prices for a farmer across the ocean. The same government desperation that drains gold can open lines of credit for bankers who know how to arrange them. By the autumn of 1914, the direction of gold began to change. Britain and France needed American goods. To buy them, they needed dollars or credits in the United States. They could use gold, sell American securities, or borrow. At first, gold shipments to America became part of the answer. Imagine the physical reality of that. Not numbers on a screen, not a transfer completed in seconds, but actual metal moving under guard, packed, loaded, insured, shipped across waters made dangerous by war. Gold bars and coins crossing the Atlantic because armies in Europe needed bread, copper, horses, rifles, and shells. There is something almost primitive and enormous about that image. Industrial war, with its machine guns and artillery and rail mobilization, still depended on the movement of a metal that ancient kings would have understood. Governments could print promises and issue bonds, but underneath the first phase of payment there was still the weight of gold. This is where the story begins to shift from panic to opportunity, and that shift did not feel clean to everyone watching it. In August and September, Americans were still trying to determine whether the war would produce a financial disaster. By late 1914 and into 1915, many businesses realized that Allied demand could bring enormous orders. Wheat prices rose. Munitions companies saw possibilities that would have been unimaginable in peacetime. Steel, chemicals, machinery, textiles, leather, meat packing, shipping, banking. All these sectors began to feel the pull of European need. But need is not the same as payment. Britain and France could not simply buy endlessly with cash on the counter. Their purchases strained their reserves. They had to liquidate assets, send gold, and eventually borrow on a scale that required trusted intermediaries. The war was becoming too large for ordinary trade. It needed finance shaped for emergency. The official neutrality of the United States created a strange moral and legal environment. American law allowed trade with belligerents, provided it was not direct military participation by the government. A private company could sell supplies to Britain or France. A bank could arrange credit. At least in principle, German buyers could purchase too. But the reality of sea power made the principle uneven. Britain's navy controlled Atlantic access more effectively than Germany could. The British blockade restricted Germany's ability to trade. German surface commerce was limited, and as the war went on, Germany relied more heavily on submarines to challenge Allied shipping. So the American market was legally open, but practically much more accessible to the Allies. This distinction mattered because it allowed American officials to insist that neutrality remained intact, while the actual flow of goods and credit increasingly favoured one side. To many supporters of the Allies, this was simply the natural result of naval power and lawful commerce. To critics, especially German Americans and anti-war voices, it looked like neutrality with one eye closed. The Morgans were not neutral in temperament. That is worth saying carefully. They operated under American law, and the United States government remained officially neutral. But the House of Morgan had deep cultural, financial and personal ties to Britain. Its London branch was part of its identity. Its partners moved naturally in an Anglo-American world. They believed, as many Eastern elites did, that Britain and France represented a civilization closer to their own values than Imperial Germany did. This did not mean every decision they made was driven by sentiment. Banks do not become powerful by ignoring profit, but profit and sympathy pointed in the same direction, and when that happens, men rarely experience themselves as conflicted. They experience themselves as practical. They tell themselves they're doing what the world requires. Sometimes they are. Sometimes they're also doing what benefits them. Often both are true at once. Picture 23 Wall Street in those months not as a villain's lair, because that would be too easy, but as a place where information arrived in quantities that would overwhelm most people. Cables from Europe, requests for credit, questions about exchange, reports from London, concerns from Washington, inquiries from manufacturers. The partners had to watch not only the battlefield but the bond market, the shipping market, the foreign exchange market, the state of American public opinion, and the legal boundaries of neutrality. They had to judge whether the Allies could pay. They had to judge whether American investors could be persuaded to lend. They had to judge whether the Wilson administration would tolerate large-scale credits to belligerents. They had to judge whether Germany might win quickly, leaving Allied obligations in doubt. This is the banker's version of wartime uncertainty. No shells burst overhead, but every decision carries risk, and the risks are measured in sums large enough to influence nations. One of the most revealing things about this period is how quickly war turned ordinary goods into strategic goods. Wheat was no longer just wheat. It was the difference between a civilian population staying fed and political pressure rising against a government. Horses and mules were no longer farm animals alone. They were transport power for armies that still depended heavily on animal labour, despite all their modern weapons. Copper was not just a metal. It was wire, cartridge cases, electrical equipment, communications. Cotton was not just cloth. It was uniforms, bandages, and, through chemical processing, part of explosives production. Steel was not just construction material. It was guns, ships, rails, helmets, shells. The American economy did not have to declare war to begin serving war. It only had to accept orders. Every invoice became a small attachment to Europe's struggle. For Britain, the early financial problem was urgent but manageable at first, because Britain was still the world's great financial power, and sterling still carried immense authority. London had reserves, overseas assets, tax capacity, and a global empire. It also had something Germany did not have in the same way: access to the American market through control of the sea. But even Britain could not pay for modern war indefinitely through gold and asset sales alone. France faced similar pressure, and its territory was directly invaded. The demands of war spending outran assumptions formed in peacetime. The longer the conflict lasted, the more obvious it became that the Allies would need to borrow heavily in the United States. Borrowing required confidence. Confidence required reputation. Reputation required a channel. The House of Morgan was the obvious channel because the old Morgan network had already linked American and British finance before the war. War did not create the bridge. It sent armies across it. The movement of gold to America had consequences far beyond the vaults that received it. It strengthened the American financial position. It helped New York grow in importance as a global financial centre. Before the war, London had been the unmatched centre of international finance. After the war began, London remained crucial, but its resources were strained by the demands of survival. New York, protected by distance and enriched by exports, began to rise. Gold inflows increased American banking power. Allied purchases stimulated American production. The United States began to shift from a debtor nation, long dependent on European capital, toward a creditor nation. That transformation did not happen in one afternoon, and no one standing in a Wall Street office in 1914 could see the full shape of it. But the war accelerated it dramatically. Europe was spending itself into dependence, and America was discovering what it meant to be the place where the bills were presented. There is a quiet human side to this that is easy to miss if we stay only with banks and governments. An American farmer watching grain prices rise did not necessarily think of himself as part of the Allied supply chain. He thought of a good market. A worker in a steel mill did not necessarily think of himself as connected to French artillery. He thought of wages, overtime, dangerous work, and perhaps a better week's pay. A shipyard owner thought of contracts. A banker thought of commissions, risk, and influence. A British official thought of survival. A French official thought of holding the line. The same economic fact looked different depending on where a person stood. That is how war economies spread. They do not announce themselves in a single language. They speak in prices, shortages, wages, freight rates, taxes, and rumours. People enter them one practical decision at a time, and then there was the question of securities. European investors owned American stocks and bonds, especially railroad securities, in large quantities. Selling these in America could raise dollars, which could then be used to buy supplies. But too much selling too quickly could depress markets and disrupt American finance. The closure of the New York Stock Exchange slowed the process, but it could not eliminate the underlying need. Arrangements had to be made. Securities had to be marketed or used as collateral. Gold had to be transferred. Credits had to be extended. This was the kind of complicated financial work that made a private banking house valuable. Morgan and firms like it did not merely have money sitting idle. They had relationships and judgment. They knew who might buy, who might lend, which instruments would be acceptable, and how to present risk as manageable. In wartime, that skill could be worth as much as a factory. By early 1915, the old assumption that the war would end quickly had become harder to defend. The Western Front had settled into trench warfare. Casualties were enormous. Shell consumption was far higher than expected. Governments discovered that ammunition production planned for short wars was inadequate for long industrial slaughter. Britain faced what became known as a shell crisis. France needed continuous resupply. Russia, though more distant from American purchasing channels, also struggled with equipment and transport. In that environment, the need for organised American supply became more urgent. Random purchasing by separate Allied agents competing against one another in the American market could drive up prices, create confusion, and overwhelm manufacturers. Something more centralised was needed. A banker could become a coordinator, not because he understood artillery better than soldiers, but because he understood contracts, credit, and the American business landscape. This is the place where Morgan's role begins to change in character. At first, the firm is part of the financial response to panic and exchange disruption. Then it becomes a channel for stabilising payments. Then it begins moving towards something much larger, acting as the purchasing agent for the British government in the United States. That step was not merely clerical. It meant standing between a government at war and the vast productive capacity of a neutral nation. It meant filtering requests, placing orders, selecting suppliers, arranging financing, and managing the flow of goods. It meant the House of Morgan would help translate European military need into American industrial action. This is where the desk in New York begins to reach into factories across the country. The moral tension sharpened as the numbers grew. A small loan might be explained as ordinary commerce. A large loan could be defended the same way, but it felt different. A few shipments of supplies could be called trade. A constant stream of munitions, food and equipment looked more like participation without uniforms. The Wilson administration wrestled with these questions. At times, officials worried that loans to belligerents might compromise neutrality, but banning credits would also interfere with American trade and might favour Germany indirectly by limiting the Allies' ability to use the American market, while the British blockade already limited German access. The administration's position evolved, and in practice, Allied borrowing expanded. The boundary between neutrality and economic alignment became less a wall than a curtain, and behind it men kept moving boxes. I want you to think about gold again, because it is the best way to feel the transition from old world to new. In 1914, gold crossing the Atlantic still represented the old discipline of international finance. It was final payment, tangible reserve, proof that a promise had substance behind it. But the war was too large for gold alone. The metal could begin the process, but it could not carry the full weight of years of slaughter. Once gold shipments and asset sales were not enough, credit had to expand, and credit depends on belief about the future. Will Britain survive? Will France survive? Will their governments remain capable of taxing, borrowing and paying? Will the sea lanes remain open? Will American investors trust Allied bonds? Will Washington permit the system to continue? The House of Morgan's business in the war years was, in part, the business of turning belief into money, before events had proven whether that belief was justified. There is something uncomfortable in that, but also something essential to understanding modern power. Armies fight with weapons, but weapons are made before battles. They are made because someone finances the factory, orders the material, pays the workers, ships the finished product, and accepts the promise of future payment. The soldier sees the rifle, the banker sees the chain of obligation behind it. Both are real. Both are part of the war. And by the end of 1914, that chain was stretching more tightly across the Atlantic every week. The United States still watched from outside the battlefield. Wilson still spoke the language of neutrality. Many Americans still wanted nothing to do with Europe's catastrophe, but gold had crossed, securities had moved, orders had been placed, factories had begun adjusting. And at the centre of the growing Allied effort to turn American abundance into usable war power stood the House of Morgan, no longer merely the heir of an old Wall Street reputation, but the firm through which Britain and France would increasingly try to buy time, survival, and victory. The next movement in the story begins when that role becomes official, or as official as anything could be while America remained neutral. Britain needed more than scattered purchases. It needed an organised American supply system, something disciplined enough to prevent waste and powerful enough to command attention from manufacturers who were suddenly being courted by every Allied buyer with urgent instructions and imperfect money. The answer would place J.P. Morgan and Company in a position that few private banks had ever occupied. It would make the firm not just a lender, not just an advisor, but the storekeeper of empires at war, the office through which enormous quantities of American goods began their journey from factory floors and farm fields to the armies and civilians of Britain and France. At first, the title sounded almost harmless. Purchasing agent. It had the dry taste of office work. The kind of phrase that belongs in a ledger, not in the history of a war. It didn't sound like command. It did not sound like influence. It did not sound like the sort of appointment that could pull a neutral country's factories, railroads, banks, farms, and shipyards into the daily life of a European battlefield. But that is exactly why it mattered. Some of the most important changes in history arrive wearing ordinary names. A purchasing agent is just someone who buys things for someone else. That is all. And yet, in January of 1915, when the British government turned to J.P. Morgan and Company to act as its purchasing agent in the United States, that plain little phrase opened a door through which an astonishing amount of American power would pass. By then, the war had already begun to show its true appetite. The first illusions had not vanished all at once, but they were weakening. The hope that the armies would march, clash, settle matters, and return home by Christmas had been buried in mud, casualties, and trenches. The Western Front was hardening into a line that seemed to eat men without moving very much. The old calculations about ammunition, food, horses, uniforms, guns, and money had been wrong. Not a little wrong. Completely wrong. European governments had planned for a war of movement, a war with dramatic campaigns and decisive battles. What they found instead was an industrial furnace. Every day required more shells, more rifles, more rails, more boots, more bread, more meat, more copper, more coal, more bandages, more everything. A modern army did not simply stand in a field and fight. It consumed entire economies. Britain had factories of its own. France had factories of its own. Their empires had resources. Their governments had tax systems, financial markets, and the ability to command production. But none of that was enough. The war was too large and too fast. France had lost industrial regions in the German advance. Britain was raising and equipping armies on a scale it had never maintained before. The Royal Navy guarded the seas, but ships still had to be loaded with something. Every military plan made in London or Paris eventually ran into the same practical question. Where will the material come from? And across the Atlantic stood the United States, officially neutral, physically distant from the battlefield, and full of the very things the Allies needed. Wheat fields, steel mills, packing houses, machine shops, chemical works, textile factories, coal mines, railroads, ports, banks. It was not yet a belligerent nation, but it was already becoming the warehouse of the war. At the beginning, Allied buying in America was messy. That is the word to hold on to. Messy. Different agents from different Allied governments and departments came looking for supplies, often competing against one another. One British buyer might chase rifles, another might pursue shells. French agents might bid against British agents for the same machine tools or raw materials. Prices rose. Manufacturers received conflicting inquiries. Some promised more than they could deliver. Some took advantage of urgency. Some did not know whether these foreign orders were reliable. In a war economy, confusion is expensive. If 3 buyers representing friendly governments compete for the same steel, the steel does not multiply. It simply becomes more costly. If several agents place duplicate orders because no one knows what anyone else is doing, factories clog with promises that cannot be fulfilled. If manufacturers worry that a foreign government might not pay, they hesitate, demand advances, or seek guarantees. What Britain needed was not only access to American goods, it needed order in the act of buying them. This was the opening for Morgan. The House of Morgan understood something that governments often struggled with when they entered the private market at emergency speed. Buying at scale is not just a matter of wanting things badly enough. You need credit. You need relationships. You need a reputation that makes the manufacturer believe the order is real. You need someone who can speak to banks, railroads, insurers, shipping firms, and industrial executives in the language they already trust. A British official could arrive with authority from London, but a Morgan partner could walk into an American boardroom with something more immediately useful: the assurance that payment, financing, and future business could be arranged. To a factory owner asked to expand production for war orders, that mattered. New machines cost money. New buildings cost money. Additional labour cost money. Raw materials had to be bought before finished goods could be delivered. A government order was exciting, but without financing it could also be dangerous. Morgan could turn excitement into a bankable contract. The firm did not work alone, and we should be careful not to imagine one man at a desk, personally choosing every crate and every supplier. This was a system. Inside it, one of the most important figures was Edward Stettinius Sr., a Morgan partner who would become central to the purchasing operation. Stettinius was not a general, but his work had military consequences. He helped organise the enormous flow of Allied orders through what became Morgan's export department. The task was to make American supply less chaotic, to coordinate demand, to reduce wasteful bidding, to evaluate manufacturers, to help arrange advances when factories needed to expand, and to keep the river of goods moving toward ports. It was office work, yes, but office work at a scale that bent industry toward war. The paperwork was not separate from the battlefield. It was the part of the battlefield that happened before the shell was fired. I want you to picture what this meant in physical terms, because words like procurement and credit can make the whole thing feel bloodless. Somewhere in Pennsylvania, a steel mill receives an order connected to Allied need. Somewhere in Connecticut or Massachusetts, a factory begins making components that will not stay in America. Somewhere in the Midwest, grain is gathered not simply for domestic markets, but for an ocean crossing. In Chicago, meatpackers prepare products that may feed soldiers or civilians under wartime pressure. In horse markets and stockyards, animals are selected for a war that still depends on muscle as well as machinery. In rail yards, loaded cars wait to move east. At docks, crates, barrels, bales, and machines become part of a vast export traffic. Before any of it reaches Europe, before it is unloaded in Britain or France, before it is consumed, worn out, fired, eaten, broken, or buried, it passes through a chain of contracts and credit. Morgan's role was to make that chain usable. The commission was 1%. That sounds small if you say it quickly. 1% is the kind of figure that seems modest, almost restrained. But 1% of an enormous number is not modest at all. As Allied purchases through the Morgan system grew toward billions of dollars, that single percent became a fortune. The firm's commission on roughly $3 billion in activity has often been summarised as about $30 million. In 1915, money, that was not a handsome fee. It was an empire of fees. Critics did not need much imagination to see the problem. If a private bank earned money every time Allied purchases moved through its hands, then the longer the war continued and the larger the purchases became, the more profitable the arrangement could be. Morgan's defenders could answer fairly that the work was enormous, risky and necessary, and that the Allies needed exactly this sort of mechanism. Both things could be true. The service could be useful, and the profits could be uncomfortable. History is often like that. It refuses to become clean just because we prefer clean judgments. To Britain, Morgan offered organisation at the point where organisation was desperately needed. To American manufacturers, Morgan offered credibility. To American banks, Morgan offered structure. To the Wilson administration, Morgan offered a problem wrapped inside a solution. The United States wanted to remain neutral, but it also wanted American commerce to continue. It did not want to strangle exports, especially when farmers and manufacturers were eager to sell. At the same time, the administration understood that financing Allied purchases could make neutrality look thin. If Britain could buy through Morgan because British sea power kept its routes open, while Germany could not buy on anything like the same scale because of blockade and naval realities, then American trade would flow overwhelmingly to one side. Was that America's fault? Was it simply the consequence of geography and naval power? Was it neutral to sell to whoever could reach your market, even if only one side could reach it? These were not theoretical questions. They lived inside every purchase order. The British also understood that Morgan's value was not only financial, it was social and political. The firm knew who mattered in American business. It knew which manufacturers could deliver and which merely talked. It knew which banks might participate in credits and which would resist. It knew how to present Allied needs in a way that sounded like commerce rather than intervention. That last point mattered greatly. The language had to remain businesslike because the United States was still officially outside the war. A private bank buying goods for a foreign government did not sound like a national commitment. It sounded like trade. A loan floated by bankers did not sound like an alliance. It sounded like finance. But over time, the accumulation of businesslike acts created something that looked very much like alignment. France's relationship with Morgan developed alongside Britain's, though not always smoothly. Britain had deeper old ties to the House of Morgan, and Morgan officials often showed a preference for British methods and British contacts. France needed American supplies too, and by 1915 Morgan had become central to French purchasing and finance as well. But relationships are not mechanical things. They are built from personalities, habits, trust, irritation, and the small frictions that emerge when desperate governments must work through private intermediaries. French officials did not always like depending on Morgan. Morgan partners did not always find French representatives easy to manage. The British, with their long financial connection to the firm, often seemed to receive a more natural sympathy. That imbalance mattered because the Allies were not a single body. They were partners under pressure, and pressure reveals differences. Morgan stood between them and the American market, which meant the firm sometimes had to act as organiser, banker, purchasing agent, referee and gatekeeper all at once. There is something strange about the word storekeeper in this context, because it suggests shelves and inventory, a modest person standing behind a counter, weighing goods and keeping accounts. But the House of Morgan became a storekeeper in a much larger and more troubling sense. It helped manage access to the American storehouse. The shelves were the United States itself. On one shelf, copper. On another, wheat. On another, explosives. On another, locomotives and rails. On another, cotton, leather, medical supplies, trucks, machine tools, steel plates, canned meat and chemicals. The customers were governments at war. The payments were made through gold, securities, loans and credit. The delivery routes crossed an ocean where the war increasingly reached under the water through submarines. Nothing about this store was ordinary, but the basic question remained the same. What do you need? How much can you pay? Who can produce it? And how quickly can it be delivered? For the American companies receiving these orders, the war could feel like a terrible blessing. That phrase is ugly, but it fits. Many firms had struggled through uncertainty when the war began. Then Allied demand brought contracts that filled factories and expanded payrolls. Some manufacturers invested in new capacity. Some communities boomed. Workers found overtime. Wages in certain industries improved, though often alongside longer hours and dangerous conditions. The prosperity was uneven, and it rested on violence elsewhere. A town making shells might experience the war as employment before it experienced it as loss. A farmer selling grain might experience it as higher prices before he saw casualty lists from American units later on. This is one of the uncomfortable facts of distance. When war is far away, its first arrival may come not as grief, but as business. Morgan's purchasing role also required advances to manufacturers. Some firms could not simply accept massive orders without upfront money. They needed to build plant capacity, purchase raw materials, hire workers, and reorganize production. The House of Morgan and the British government advanced funds in certain cases to help companies meet demand. This tied American industry more tightly to Allied success. A factory that had expanded for Allied orders wanted those orders to continue and wanted the buyers to remain solvent. Banks that financed production wanted the same. Investors who bought Allied securities wanted the same. The more these relationships multiplied, the more America's economic interests leaned toward an Allied victory, even before the American flag was carried into battle. Again, this does not mean bankers alone caused American intervention. It means the economic landscape in which intervention was debated had already been shaped by years of trade and credit. Opponents of Morgan saw the danger clearly, though they sometimes described it in overheated terms. To them, Wall Street was not merely taking advantage of the war. It was fastening the United States to the Allied cause so tightly that escape would become impossible. If Britain and France owed American banks and investors vast sums, what would happen if they lost? Would American finance accept that calmly? Would the pressure to protect those loans shape policy? Would newspapers friendly to the Allies, advertisers tied to war production, and bankers tied to Allied repayment all push public opinion in the same direction? These fears were not absurd. They were part of a serious debate about whether private finance could compromise public neutrality. Even people who sympathised with Britain and France had to ask whether the country understood the road it was walking. Supporters answered that Germany had made its own bed through militarism and invasion, that Britain and France were natural customers, that American citizens had a right to trade, and that commerce did not become immoral simply because one buyer was at war. They argued that cutting off credits would damage American farmers and manufacturers, and might effectively reward Germany for being blocked from the seas. They also pointed out that the Allies were not asking America to fight, at least not yet. They were buying goods. They were borrowing money. Those were ordinary activities in an international economy. The fact that the scale was extraordinary did not, in their view, change the principle. That was the defence, and it carried weight. But scale always changes principle in practice. A bucket of water and a flood are both water. No one behaves as if they are the same. Inside Morgan's offices, the work must have had a relentless quality. More orders, more cables, more negotiations. More pressure from Allied officials, more questions from manufacturers, more political sensitivity, more money moving through the firm's hands. It is easy to imagine the partners as cold men counting commissions, and no doubt profit was never far from their minds. But they were also operating under genuine strain. The war's demands were unpredictable, shipping was vulnerable, neutrality rules shifted, public criticism grew. The Allies needed more than they could easily pay for. American manufacturers complained, delayed, bargained, and sometimes failed. Every large order carried reputational risk. If Morgan promised that a supplier could deliver and the supplier did not, someone in London or Paris would be furious. If Morgan backed a credit that became politically controversial, Washington might react. If the firm seemed too openly an arm of the British war effort, critics at home would have fresh ammunition. The storekeeper had to keep the shelves moving without appearing too much like a quartermaster for one side of the war. The appointment also changed the meaning of the Morgan name in the public imagination. Before the war, Morgan had symbolised concentrated finance, railroad reorganisations, steel, panic rescues, and the mysterious power of private banking. During the war, the name began to attach itself to shells, ships, rifles, and Allied debt. It became possible for critics to draw a line from a dead soldier in Europe to a banker in New York and say, "There, that is who profits." Whether the line was always fair is another matter. War simplifies anger because anger wants a face. Morgan provided one. Jack Morgan, already living under his father's shadow, now found himself under another shadow as well. The suspicion that his firm's private interest and the nation's foreign policy were becoming entangled. There was even an element of secrecy around certain actions, or at least discretion pushed to its limit. The House of Morgan sometimes acted quietly on behalf of British interests in ways that went beyond public purchasing. One often cited example involved efforts to prevent German influence over Bethlehem Steel, a crucial American arms producer. The fear was that German investors or sympathisers might gain leverage over a company whose output mattered to the Allies. Morgan's role in helping block that possibility showed how purchasing, finance, corporate control, and wartime intelligence could blur together. A bank arranging orders might also worry about who controlled the factories filling those orders. In ordinary commerce, ownership mattered. In war commerce, ownership could become a strategic issue. Now pause with this for a moment. The United States is neutral. Its president speaks carefully about impartiality. Millions of Americans want no part in Europe's war. And yet a private bank in New York is organising Allied purchasing, advancing money to American firms, helping coordinate the supply of war materials, protecting key producers from feared enemy influence, and preparing the ground for enormous loans. If neutrality were only a legal category, perhaps this could be managed. But neutrality is also a feeling, a public expectation, a moral posture. And by 1915, the feeling of neutrality was becoming harder to sustain because too many practical facts pointed in one direction. The ships leaving American ports did not carry equal cargoes to both sides. The credits did not flow equally. The profits did not arise equally. The relationships were not equal. Paper neutrality remained. Material neutrality was slipping. Still, for the Allies, there was no time to worry about the philosophical neatness of it. Men at the front needed shells. Civilians needed food. Governments needed to keep morale from breaking. Armies needed transport. Hospitals needed supplies. The war had become a contest not only of courage and strategy, but of endurance. Which side could keep men fed, armed, clothed, supplied and financed longer than the other? Britain's sea power gave the Allies access to America. Morgan helped turn access into organised supply. That combination was immensely important. It meant that the productive strength of the United States could be harnessed without the United States formally joining the war. The Allies could draw on American abundance while American politicians continued debating what neutrality required. There is a quiet but important difference between selling something and becoming necessary. In the early months of the war, American companies sold goods. By the time Morgan's purchasing system matured, American production was becoming necessary to Allied endurance. That is a much stronger bond. A seller can step away more easily than a lifeline can be cut. The more Britain and France relied on American supplies, the more their future depended on continued access to American credit. The more American businesses relied on Allied orders, the more their prosperity depended on Allied survival. The House of Morgan stood at the crossing point of those dependencies. That is why the purchasing agency mattered so much. It was not just a fee arrangement. It was a mechanism that made dependence organised. For ordinary people, most of this remained invisible. They might read headlines about loans or exports, but they did not see the full map. They saw their own piece. A worker saw a factory whistle and a longer shift. A farmer saw a better price. A dock worker saw more cargo. A banker saw new securities. A pacifist saw danger. A German American saw partiality. A British diplomat saw relief. A French official saw necessity mixed with irritation. A Morgan partner saw a system that had to be managed and a balance sheet that had to make sense. Everyone was looking at the same war economy from a different window. The task of history is to walk from window to window until the whole building becomes visible. By the middle of 1915, the Morgan operation had become one of the most important private channels of wartime supply in the world. Its purchasing work represented a huge share of Allied buying in the United States. The firm's export department under Stettinius handled an astonishing volume of business. The commission accumulated. The criticism accumulated too. But the machine kept running because the need behind it was real. Britain and France could not stop buying. American firms did not want to stop selling. The Wilson administration did not want to sever commerce. Morgan did not want to surrender a role that placed the firm at the centre of world events. So the arrangement continued, and with every month it became less temporary. What had begun as a response to emergency was becoming a structure. And structures have consequences. Once a system exists, people build around it. Factories expand around expected orders. Banks organise around expected credits. Governments plan around expected access. Shipping schedules, insurance arrangements, procurement offices, and political assumptions begin to take the system for granted. Then, if someone suggests stopping, the answer is no longer simply yes or no. The answer becomes, what happens to everything already built on top of it? This is how entanglement works. It does not require a conspiracy. It requires repetition. One order becomes 10. 10 become 100. A temporary credit becomes a program. A program becomes an expectation. An expectation becomes a dependency. By the time people argue about whether they should have begun, beginning is already in the past. That is the world Morgan helped create in 1915. Not alone, never alone. But centrally enough that no honest account can leave the firm at the margins. The House of Morgan had become a kind of unofficial quartermaster across the Atlantic, though without a uniform and without a public oath. Its weapons were contracts, credit, reputation, and access. Its battlefield was the American market. Its victories were measured in deliveries made, loans placed, factories financed, and ships loaded. Its profits were counted in commissions and influence. Its risks were counted in public suspicion, political backlash, and the terrifying possibility that the Allies might lose after borrowing and buying on a scale no one had previously imagined. The story now begins to move from buying to financing, because the more the Allies purchased, the more urgently they needed money that gold and securities alone could not provide. A storekeeper can organise goods, but someone still has to pay the bill. By late 1915, that bill had grown so large that ordinary arrangements were no longer enough. Britain and France needed a loan that would not be hidden in the corners of private finance. A loan so large that it would announce a new stage in America's relationship to the war. Morgan would have to persuade not just a few bankers, but a broad syndicate of financial institutions and investors that lending to the Allies was safe, legal, profitable, and perhaps even necessary. The quiet machinery of purchases was still running, but beneath it another machine was beginning to turn, made of bonds, commissions, public opinion, political pressure, and the uneasy question of whether a neutral nation could finance one side of a world war and still call itself neutral. By the time the great Allied purchasing machine was running through the House of Morgan, the war had entered a phase where almost every object had a second life. A sack of wheat was no longer only food, it was endurance. A shell casing was no longer only brass, it was time bought for an army under pressure. A ship was no longer only transport, it was a wager against weather, steel, mines, torpedoes, and the invisible arithmetic of loss. A loan was no longer only a promise to repay, It was a bridge built over a gap between what Britain and France needed immediately and what they could afford at that moment. And in New York, behind the doors of 23 Wall Street, the House of Morgan stood at the place where all those second lives had to be measured, priced, arranged, guaranteed, and moved. This is the part of the story where the drama becomes harder to see because it hides inside systems. No single image can hold it. It is not one banker signing one paper. It is not one ship leaving one harbour. It is not one factory changing from ploughs to shells. It is thousands of decisions repeating day after day until repetition itself becomes historical force. A British official sends a request. A French representative argues for priority. A Morgan partner studies the figures. A manufacturer explains what he can produce if he receives an advance. A bank joins a syndicate. A railroad moves freight east. A port becomes congested. A ship waits for cargo. Insurance is negotiated. Cables cross the ocean. A government spends money it does not yet have, on goods not yet made, for soldiers not yet supplied, in a war no one now expects to end quickly. This is the quiet machinery. It does not look like battle, but without it the battle cannot continue. The central problem was simple enough to state and almost impossible to solve neatly. Britain and France needed to keep buying from the United States, and they needed to buy at a scale that grew larger with every month of war. But buying required dollars, and dollars had to come from somewhere. At first, the Allies could pay with gold. Then they could sell securities they owned in America. Then they could draw on existing credits. But those methods could not last forever. Gold reserves were not bottomless. Securities could not be liquidated indefinitely without damaging markets. The war was no longer an emergency measured in weeks. It was becoming a financial climate, something governments had to live inside. The Allies did not merely need goods, they needed credit large enough to keep the goods moving. That need led to one of the most important financial events of the early war years, the Great Anglo-French Loan of 1915. The amount was $500 million, a number so large that it is easy for the mind to slide past it without understanding its weight. $500 million in 1915 was not a large loan in the casual modern sense. It was enormous. It was a public announcement that Britain and France would borrow directly in the American market, and that American investors, banks, and financial institutions would be asked to place their confidence in Allied survival. The House of Morgan arranged the loan, leading a large syndicate of banks and trust companies. This mattered because Morgan was no longer merely advancing funds behind the scenes or organising purchases through private channels. The firm was asking the American financial public to participate, to buy Allied obligations, to take a side in the future without calling it that. Now, to people who already supported Britain and France, this seemed natural. The Allies were fighting Germany. They needed supplies. America had supplies. American investors could earn interest. American business could prosper. Everyone understood the arrangement, or thought they did. But to others, the loan felt like a line being crossed. If American citizens bought British and French bonds on a massive scale, then what happened if Britain and France lost? What happened to those investors? What happened to the banks that had distributed the loan? What happened to the House of Morgan's position? The question was not only whether the Allies could repay, the question was whether American financial interests would become so tied to Allied victory that the country's political imagination would begin to narrow. A neutral nation can sell goods and still claim neutrality. It can lend money and still make legal arguments. But when the sums become enormous, the legal argument begins to sound less satisfying. People begin to ask not only what is loud, but what is happening. Morgan's defenders insisted that the loan was commerce, not alliance. The United States was not sending troops. It was not committing its navy. It was not signing a treaty. Private investors were buying bonds, and private bankers were arranging them. That argument was not meaningless. In law and in practice, there remained a difference between a government declaring war and a banking syndicate placing securities, But the critics understood something too. Money creates attachment. Debt creates expectation. Once large numbers of Americans had a financial stake in Allied repayment, Allied defeat would no longer be a distant European outcome. It would reach into American portfolios, bank balance sheets, industrial orders, and public arguments. The war had not yet taken American soldiers in large numbers, but it had already taken American confidence hostage in quieter ways. The loan also reveals something essential about Morgan's power. The firm did not simply have money, it had the ability to organise other people's money. That was more important. No single banking house, however wealthy, could casually absorb the financial demands of World War I. What Morgan could do was gather institutions, persuade investors, structure offerings, distribute risk, and lend its name to the entire arrangement. In finance, a name can become a kind of architecture. Investors who did not personally examine every detail could look at the Morgan roll and decide that the loan had passed through a gate of judgment. That did not eliminate risk, but it made risk respectable. The House of Morgan transformed Allied borrowing from a foreign need into an American financial product. There is a strange intimacy in that transformation. A schoolteacher with savings, a small-town banker, an insurance company, a trust office, a wealthy family, a university endowment, all could become connected to the war through a bond. They did not need to know the smell of cordite or the sound of artillery. They only needed to believe that Britain and France would endure and repay. Their confidence became part of the Allied supply line. A shell fired on the Western Front might be linked backward not only to a factory, but to an investor who had never seen Europe. That is what modern finance does. It turns distance into participation without requiring the participant to feel fully involved. You can be connected and still feel far away. The other half of the machinery was physical, and it was immense. Money by itself does not win a war. Money has to become something. It has to become wheat flour, canned beef, artillery shells, rifles, wire, boots, uniforms, trucks, locomotives, ships, horses, leather, copper, chemicals, and oil. The House of Morgan's purchasing operation helped turn Allied credit into American production. That meant sorting out which manufacturers could deliver, which needed financing, which were exaggerating their capacity, which had to expand facilities, and which could be trusted with urgent contracts. The work required technical knowledge, or at least access to technical knowledge. A bank did not need to know how to forge every part of a gun, but it needed to know which company could be believed when it said it could. Shells became one of the great symbols of the war's industrial hunger. The armies used ammunition at rates that stunned pre-war planners. Artillery dominated the Western Front. Before an assault, guns might fire for hours or days, trying to cut wire, smash trenches, silence enemy batteries and break morale. The result was a demand for shells so great that entire political crises formed around shortages. Britain's shell crisis in 1915 helped bring down one government arrangement and push the country toward more centralised control of munitions. Across the Atlantic, American factories saw orders that promised profit but required adaptation. Making shells was not the same as making ordinary metal goods. It demanded precision, materials, inspection, and speed. A defective shell could kill the men firing it or fail when needed. The pressure to produce was intense, but the pressure to produce correctly was just as serious. Imagine an American plant floor during this shift. Machines running longer, workers learning new processes, inspectors checking tolerances, managers studying contracts tied to governments they will never meet. Orders arriving through channels connected to Morgan's purchasing system. The war is not present in a patriotic poster yet, not for America, not fully. It is present in overtime, noise, filings, heat, accidents, pay envelopes, and rumours. Some workers may oppose the war, some may support the Allies, some may not care deeply either way, but the factory has been pulled into the war's rhythm. A man can spend 10 hours shaping metal for a shell and still go home saying his country is neutral. That is one of the uneasy truths of the period. Wheat carried a different kind of weight. It did not explode. It did not require the same public moral argument as munitions. But it was just as necessary. Britain imported much of its food, and the war made food security a matter of national survival. A civilian population that cannot eat becomes restless. An army that cannot eat cannot fight. American grain moved eastward by rail, gathered from farms and elevators, priced by global demand, shipped across the Atlantic under increasing danger. Farmers who had struggled in earlier years could see higher prices and stronger demand. For them, the war could appear first as a market. It raised the value of what they grew. It turned the harvest into part of an international emergency. Again, the moral experience depended on distance. The same bushel of wheat could mean profit in Kansas, policy in London, cargo in New York, and bread in a British city worried about submarines. Meat moved too. So did cotton. So did leather for boots and harnesses. Horses and mules were purchased in huge numbers because armies still depended on animals for transport, artillery movement, supply wagons, and countless tasks behind the lines. There is a tendency to imagine World War I as entirely modern, all machine guns and artillery and aircraft. It was modern, but it was also full of animals. The British and French need for horses and mules reached into American farms and markets. Animals bred for work found themselves part of a conflict across the ocean. Their bodies became logistics. Their purchase required agents, money, transport, veterinary inspection and shipping. The war consumed flesh in more forms than one. Then there were ships, and ships made everything uncertain. A loan could be arranged, a factory could produce, a train could deliver goods to port, but the ocean still had to be crossed. At the beginning of the war, Britain's navy gave the Allies a decisive advantage in access to American goods. But Germany understood that Britain's dependence on sea routes was also a weakness. Submarine warfare became one answer. The U-boat made the supply chain frightening in a new way because it turned open water into a hidden battlefield. A cargo could leave an American port with legal papers, insurance, and careful financing, and still vanish beneath the Atlantic. Every shipment carried not only goods, but risk. Insurance rates reflected it. Shipping decisions reflected it. Diplomatic tensions reflected it. The same ocean that allowed America to supply the Allies also kept reminding everyone that neutrality was not a shield made of iron. The sinking of the Lusitania in May 1915 brought the danger into American public life with terrible force. The ship was British, but many Americans were on board, and the loss of civilian lives shocked the United States. The disaster did not immediately bring America into the war, but it changed the emotional climate. It made submarine warfare impossible to treat as a distant technical issue. It also sharpened the contradiction at the heart of American neutrality. Americans wanted the right to trade and travel across the seas. Germany argued that Britain's blockade was starving its enemies and that ships carrying goods to Britain were part of the Allied war effort. The United States insisted on neutral rights. Britain depended on the traffic. Germany tried to disrupt it. Morgan's world of loans and shipments sat inside this larger crisis. Every cargo financed for the Allies moved through waters where international law, military necessity and human fear collided. The ships themselves became floating ledgers. In their holds were goods already paid for, goods bought on credit, goods insured against loss, goods tied to contracts, goods expected by governments planning military operations or civilian supply. A torpedo did not only destroy steel and cargo, it destroyed financial assumptions. Someone had lent against that shipment. Someone had expected delivery. Someone had counted it in a supply calculation. Someone would make a claim. Someone would argue over liability. The violence of the war reached backward into paperwork. That is what made the machinery so complex. Nothing stood alone. By 1916, Allied dependence on American credit had deepened. The 1915 loan had been enormous, but the war kept spending. More credits were needed. Morgan and associated banks continued to arrange financing. The British government increasingly had to mobilise its overseas assets, manage exchange and coordinate purchases more tightly. The financial relationship between Britain and the United States became one of the central facts of the war. Britain was still powerful, still imperial, still capable of enormous effort, but it was also bleeding money. France was fighting on its own soil and needed constant support. The United States, still formally outside the war, became the great reservoir from which the Allies drew. The reservoir was not free. It came with interest, commissions, political consequences, and growing influence for American finance. This is the moment when New York's rise becomes visible. Before the war, London had been the centre of the financial world in a way that is difficult to overstate. The pound sterling, London discount houses, British banks, and the Empire's trade networks gave Britain a central position. But war strained that system. Gold flowed to America. Allied borrowing expanded in New York. American exports surged. The United States shifted more clearly from a nation that had depended on European capital to one that could lend to Europe. The House of Morgan was both a beneficiary and an agent of that shift. It did not single-handedly move the world's financial centre westward, but it stood close to the movement as it happened. The war made America richer in claims on Europe while Europe became poorer in the effort to survive. And yet wealth during war has a shadow. Every profit made from Allied purchases could be described as a reward for service, or as blood money, depending on who was speaking. A banker saw fees for arranging difficult credit. A manufacturer saw payment for dangerous urgent production. A worker saw wages. A critic saw a financial class growing rich while others died. The same dollar wore different moral clothing in different rooms. This is why Morgan became such a target. The firm was too visible, too central, too profitable, and too closely associated with one side of the war to escape suspicion. Even if every contract had been perfectly legal, legality did not satisfy the deeper anxiety. Many Americans worried that private profit had become entangled with public destiny. There were also practical tensions between the Allies and Morgan. Dependence does not always produce gratitude. Britain and France needed the firm, but they did not always enjoy needing it. Morgan's purchasing agents sometimes frustrated officials who wanted faster action or different priorities. Manufacturers complained about terms. Allied representatives argued over allocation. The scale of the operation made mistakes inevitable. No machine this large runs silently. It groans. It jams, it overheats, it produces paperwork faster than anyone can fully master. Still, it kept operating because the alternative was worse. Disorganised buying, uncertain payment, and uncontrolled competition in the American market would have weakened the Allied supply effort. Morgan's machinery was imperfect, but it was machinery, and machinery mattered. I want to pause over the personal position of Jack Morgan in all this. He was not a battlefield commander, not a president, not a prime minister, but he lived under pressures that were political even when expressed through finance. If he refused certain risks, the Allies might suffer. If he accepted too many, his firm and American investors might be dangerously exposed. If he appeared too pro-British, critics at home would intensify. If he acted too cautiously, London might look elsewhere or accuse the firm of failing its role. He had inherited a banking house built on decisiveness, but the war presented decisions without clean boundaries. His father had reorganised railroads and forced bankers into rooms during panics. Jack Morgan had to navigate a world war, while his country insisted it was not in it. The public debate grew sharper as loans and exports grew. William Jennings Bryan, who had served as Wilson's Secretary of State before resigning in 1915, represented a strain of American opinion deeply suspicious of policies that might draw the country toward war. Others warned that lending to belligerents gave lenders an interest in intervention. German-American newspapers criticized the imbalance. Pacifists objected to munition sales. Progressives questioned the power of Wall Street. On the other side, pro-Allied voices argued that German militarism had to be resisted, that Britain and France were defending civilization, and that American trade with them was both legal and honourable. Morgan did not create this debate, but its critics often placed the firm at the centre because it gave the debate a concrete shape. It is easier to oppose a banking house than an entire global system. The phrase merchants of death would become more famous later, especially in the investigations and arguments of the 1930s, but the suspicion behind it was already alive during World War I. The idea was that arms makers and bankers profited from war and therefore had incentives to encourage it or prolong it. In its bluntest form, the accusation can become too simple, as if wars happen only because businessmen wish to sell weapons. Governments, empires, alliances, nationalism, militarism, fear, and strategy all matter. But the accusation survives because it points to something real. War creates markets for destruction. Some people make fortunes in those markets. Those fortunes can distort politics, public opinion, and policy. The House of Morgan's wartime role sat directly in that uncomfortable territory. It was helping the Allies survive. It was also profiting from the process. Inside the broader machinery, communication was constant. Cables from London and Paris had to be decoded, interpreted, answered. Time mattered. Prices changed. Ships filled. Factories reached capacity. A delay in financing could delay production. A delay in production could delay shipment. A delay in shipment could leave an army short. The war compressed decision-making. In peacetime, a large industrial contract might be negotiated with patience. In wartime, patience could cost lives. But haste could waste money or produce failure. Morgan's agents had to balance urgency against reliability. They had to know when to push and when to doubt. That is a skill rarely honoured in dramatic histories because it does not produce a heroic pose. It produces fewer disasters than there might otherwise have been, and fewer disasters are hard to photograph. The more the Allies borrowed, the more American investors had to be persuaded that repayment was likely. That persuasion rested on several assumptions. Britain had an empire and enormous tax capacity. France had a strong financial tradition and national will. The Allies controlled access to global resources. Germany, despite military strength, faced blockade and growing strain. The United States market could supply what the Allies needed. The war would eventually end with the borrowers intact. These assumptions were reasonable enough for many investors, but they were still assumptions. No one in 1915 or 1916 knew the future. Men bought bonds in a world where the front lines barely moved and casualty lists grew. Confidence had to look past the mud. There is something revealing in the way finance turns catastrophe into schedules, interest dates, maturity dates, delivery dates, settlement dates. The war on the ground often seemed timeless to the men trapped in it. One day of shelling following another, one muddy trench replacing another. But in the offices that financed it, time was divided into coupons, contracts, and repayment terms. This does not mean the bankers were untouched by the war's horror. Some understood it clearly, but their work required translation. Pain became expenditure. Need became order. Risk became rate. Survival became creditworthiness. That translation is necessary in a modern state, and it is also morally unsettling. The machine cannot run unless someone performs it. As 1916 moved on, America's position became harder to describe, honestly, as detached. The nation was still not a belligerent. Its young men had not yet been drafted into the American Expeditionary Forces. Wilson would campaign for re-election with the slogan that he had kept the country out of war. And yet American money, goods and ships were already woven into the Allied struggle. Morgan's loans helped finance purchases. American factories filled Allied orders. American farms fed Allied populations. American ships and neutral rights became diplomatic flashpoints. German submarine policy threatened the whole arrangement. The distance between economic participation and military participation was narrowing, not because one secretly became the other overnight, but because the war kept pressing on the boundary until the boundary weakened. The quiet machinery of loans, shells, wheat and ships had done something profound. It had made the Allied cause part of America's economic weather. People breathed it without always naming it. Prices, wages, exports, bank offerings, newspaper arguments, factory schedules and diplomatic crises all carried traces of the same reality. The House of Morgan sat near the centre, not controlling everything, not inventing every pressure, but connecting enough of the lines that its role became impossible to dismiss. It had helped convert American abundance into Allied endurance. It had helped convert Allied promises into American securities. It had helped convert neutral commerce into something that looked, from certain angles, like preparation. And the more that machinery turned, the harder it became for Morgan or the country to remain untouched by the side it had effectively chosen in practice. The banker could still say he was arranging lawful trade. The president could still say the nation was neutral. The investor could still say he was buying a bond. The worker could still say he was earning wages. The farmer could still say he was selling wheat. Each statement, taken alone, was true. But taken together, they described a country moving closer to the war by routes that did not yet require uniforms. The next pressure would not come only from ledgers. It would come from the sea, from public anger, from German decisions, from Allied dependence, and from the growing realization that the House of Morgan's financial commitment to Britain and France had become part of a much larger national argument. A banker can claim neutrality for only so long when every cable, every shipment, every loan, and every unpaid bill points toward the same battlefield. There is a point in every claim of neutrality where the words begin to work harder than the facts. At first, neutrality can feel clear. You do not send soldiers, you do not declare war, you do not sign an alliance, you do not order your navy into battle. You remain, at least officially, outside the conflict. But then the purchases begin, then the credits begin. Then your factories expand to serve one side. Then your ships carry goods mostly to one side because only that side can reach your ports. Then your banks hold that side's debts. Then your investors expect that side to survive. Then your newspapers argue that civilization itself may depend on that side's victory. And somewhere along the way, without a parade, without a vote, without a single day that everyone can point to and say this was the moment, neutrality becomes more difficult to believe. That is where the House of Morgan stood by 1916. It had not declared war. It could not declare war. It was a private banking firm, not a government. But it had become so deeply connected to Britain and France that its own financial future, its reputation, its clients, its contracts, and its daily work all leaned toward an Allied victory. This did not require Jack Morgan to wake up each morning and say to himself that America must enter the war. The situation was subtler than that, and in some ways more powerful. His firm had built an enormous bridge between Allied need and American production, and once a bridge is carrying traffic every hour of the day, the people who built it naturally begin to fear what happens if the far bank collapses. For Jack Morgan personally, neutrality was never an empty legal formula. He came from a world that instinctively favoured Britain. His father's banking empire had been transatlantic. The House of Morgan's London connection was not decorative. It was part of the firm's bloodstream. Its partners read British cables with familiarity. They understood British credit. They trusted British institutions. They moved socially and financially in an Anglo-American world where London was not foreign in the same way Berlin was foreign. This does not mean they were blind to British self-interest. Bankers are rarely innocent about power, but sympathy and self-interest can make one another stronger. If you already believe one side is closer to your values, and that same side is also your client, borrower, trading partner and source of commission, then your moral judgment and your balance sheet begin walking in the same direction. That is one of the uncomfortable truths at the centre of this story. It is very easy to condemn a man for following profit. It is also easy to praise him for supporting a cause. What is harder is to understand the situation where profit and cause become tangled so completely that the person involved may not fully separate them anymore. Jack Morgan and his partners could tell themselves, with sincerity, that they were helping Britain and France resist German militarism. They could also know, with equal clarity, that the firm was earning enormous commissions and preserving the value of Allied debts held in the American market. The fact that both things were true did not make either one disappear. It made the firm powerful, useful, and suspect all at once. The suspicion grew because the numbers were no longer small enough to ignore. Hundreds of millions of dollars in loans had become a public fact. Billions in purchasing had passed through Morgan-connected channels. American manufacturers had reorganized themselves around Allied demand. Banks and investors had bought into Allied credit. Every month that passed made it harder to imagine the Allies losing without severe consequences for American finance and industry. That did not mean intervention was inevitable. History rarely works like a machine with one lever. But it did mean that American neutrality was no longer resting on untouched ground. It was resting on ground threaded with obligations. Critics saw this and said so. They accused Morgan and the munitions makers of dragging the United States toward war for profit. Some of those accusations were exaggerated, sometimes wildly. Not every shell order was a conspiracy. Not every loan was a secret plot. Britain and France needed supplies for reasons that had nothing to do with Wall Street, and Germany's actions at sea would become a major factor in America's movement toward war. Still, the critics were not imagining the basic entanglement. A neutral country whose banks lend heavily to one side has a stake in that side's ability to repay. A neutral country whose factories fill one side's orders has a stake in that side's continued access to markets. A neutral country whose prosperity begins to depend on wartime exports has already been changed by the war, even if its soldiers have not yet sailed. The German government understood this too. From Berlin's point of view, American neutrality looked increasingly false. The United States insisted on its right to trade with all belligerents, but British sea power meant that trade overwhelmingly favoured the Allies. Britain's blockade limited Germany's ability to buy food, raw materials and supplies from the outside world. German leaders argued that Britain was waging war on civilian life through hunger and economic pressure, while America protested more loudly when German submarines attacked ships than when the British blockade tightened around Germany. Americans saw it differently. Many believed Britain's blockade, however harsh, operated within a more familiar legal framework, while submarines that sank passenger ships and merchantmen without adequate warning violated neutral rights and human decency. Each side had its arguments. But beneath the argument stood the practical fact that Morgan Finance Commerce was helping sustain Germany's enemies. This is why the sea became so important. If Morgan's office was one end of the Allied supply line, the Atlantic was the dangerous middle. German submarines threatened to cut that line not by defeating Wall Street, but by making the ocean unusable. Every ship carrying grain, cotton, copper, rifles, chemicals, or shells was part of the argument. Was it neutral commerce? Was it contraband? Was it a legitimate target? Could a submarine commander be expected to surface, warn, inspect, and protect crews when doing so might expose the submarine to danger? Could Britain hide war goods on civilian ships and then condemn Germany for treating those ships as part of the war? Could the United States demand neutral rights, while its trade patterns so clearly favoured the Allies? These questions were argued in diplomatic notes, newspapers, cabinet rooms and shipping offices, but they also followed every cargo leaving port. The sinking of the Lusitania in May 1915 had already shown how quickly the sea could turn public opinion. Nearly 1,200 people died, including more than 100 Americans. Germany insisted the ship carried munitions and was a legitimate target under the conditions of war. Americans focused on the deaths of civilians and the horror of a passenger liner going down without the kind of warning they believed civilized warfare required. The event did not bring the United States into the war immediately, but it narrowed the space in which neutrality could operate. It made German submarine warfare a personal issue for Americans, who might otherwise have viewed the European war with distance. It also intensified the sense among pro-Allied Americans that Germany represented a danger beyond ordinary great power rivalry. For Morgan, every escalation at sea was also a financial danger. The Allied purchasing system depended on shipping. Loans depended on confidence. Confidence depended on the belief that goods could move and Britain could hold the seas. German submarine warfare threatened all of that. A successful U-boat campaign could interrupt deliveries, raise insurance costs, frighten investors, and weaken Britain's ability to continue buying. The firm's private exposure and its political sympathies again pointed in the same direction. Anything that endangered Allied sea access endangered Morgan's wartime system, and anything that drew American anger toward Germany made that system easier to defend. The Wilson administration tried to hold the centre. Wilson's position was more complex than either his admirers or critics sometimes admitted. He genuinely wanted to keep the United States out of the war if he could do so without surrendering American rights and influence. He also believed deeply in moral language, in law, in neutral rights, in the idea that America might eventually help shape a just peace. But the world kept refusing to behave according to clean categories. Britain interfered with neutral trade through blockade. Germany attacked shipping with submarines. American banks loaned to the Allies. American factories sold munitions. Immigrant communities argued among themselves. Pacifists warned against war. Preparedness advocates called for military strength. The president wanted neutrality, but neutrality had to survive contact with events, and events kept pushing. There is a revealing contrast between Wilson's public language and Morgan's private machinery. Wilson spoke of impartiality, rights, peace, law, and national honour. Morgan's people spoke of orders, credits, maturities, commissions, cargoes, and risk. Both languages described real things. The mistake is to think one was pure and the other cynical. Governments need moral language because citizens need reasons. Finance needs practical language because systems need to function. In this period, the two languages ran beside each other, sometimes cooperating, sometimes contradicting, sometimes pretending not to notice each other. While Wilson tried to preserve the nation's formal position, Morgan helped deepen the nation's material connection to the Allies. Neither alone explains what happened. Together they show why neutrality became so hard to maintain. By 1916, the American economy had been transformed by war demand. Exports to the Allies surged. Industrial production expanded. Certain companies earned profits that would have been impossible without the conflict. Workers in war-related industries often found more employment, though not always better conditions. Farmers benefited from strong demand for foodstuffs, though rising prices also created hardship for consumers. The war was no longer simply something reported from abroad. It had become part of the American business cycle, part of wages, prices, factory orders, shipping, and politics. That made the debate over neutrality less abstract. Ending loans or restricting munitions sales would not only express a moral position, it would hit jobs, profits, markets, and financial commitments. A banker in Morgan's position could not step away easily even if he wanted to. That is the trap of scale. A small transaction can be ended with inconvenience. A vast system develops roots. The Allies owed money. American investors held Allied securities. Manufacturers had contracts. Factories had expanded. Supplies were in production. Ships were scheduled. Morgan had obligations to clients on both sides of the Atlantic, meaning both the Allied governments who needed support and the American institutions and investors who had trusted Morgan's judgment. To withdraw would have been more than a business decision. It would have been a political act, a financial shock, and perhaps a betrayal in the eyes of Britain and France. Continuing was also political. There was no neutral option left for the firm in any meaningful sense. There was only the choice of how openly to acknowledge the commitment already made. Jack Morgan's public statements reflected this reality. He defended loans to the Allies as lawful and legitimate. He rejected the idea that his firm was pushing America into war for selfish reasons. He argued, as many did, that American commerce should not be halted because Germany could not access it. He also believed sincerely by all evidence that an Allied victory was preferable. There is no need to imagine him twirling a moustache in the dark. That belongs to melodrama, not history. He was a banker shaped by his class, his family, his networks, his clients, and his understanding of civilization. He saw Germany as a threat. He saw Britain and France as borrowers worthy of support. He saw Morgan's role as useful and honourable. The fact that others saw it as dangerous and self-serving did not necessarily make him feel guilty. Powerful people often experience their own interest as responsibility. This is a pattern worth noticing beyond this one story. The people most deeply embedded in a system are often the least able to see how strange the system looks from outside. To Morgan's circle, it may have seemed natural that the United States would trade with the Allies, lend to them, and insist on the right to use the seas. To a critic in the Midwest or a German-American editor, the same facts could look like proof that Eastern bankers had quietly made foreign policy for the whole Republic. Both views were shaped by position. Morgan's world was Atlantic, creditor, Anglophile, institutional, and comfortable with hierarchy. Many of his critics lived in a different America, one that distrusted Wall Street, disliked entanglement with Europe, and remembered how often ordinary people paid for decisions made by men in private rooms. The question of democracy sits underneath all of this. Who gets to move a nation toward war? Is it only Congress through a declaration? Is it the president through diplomacy? Is it public opinion through elections and newspapers? Or can banks, exporters, manufacturers and investors move a country by creating facts that politics later has to confront? In theory, the answer is clear. In practice, economic life can narrow political choices before formal decisions are made. By 1916, if the United States had tried to impose a strict embargo on loans and arms sales to all belligerents, it would have faced fierce resistance from business interests, Allied sympathisers, and those who believed Germany should not benefit from British naval weakness or American restraint. If it continued the existing pattern, critics would say it had abandoned true neutrality. Every path had a cost. Morgan's machinery did not decide the path alone, but it made one path smoother and the other more disruptive. The election of 1916 unfolded inside this tension. Wilson's supporters used the phrase, "He kept us out of war," and the phrase worked because many Americans desperately wanted it to be true and wanted it to remain true. But even as that slogan travelled across the country, the economic and diplomatic reality was more fragile than the words suggested. America had not sent armies, but American finance and industry were already deeply involved. Wilson had kept the country out of formal war, not out of the war's reach. That distinction mattered. It mattered to Morgan. It mattered to the Allies. It mattered to Germany. It mattered to every American whose livelihood had become linked, directly or indirectly, to the conflict. Germany faced its own desperate calculations. The British blockade was causing severe strain. Food shortages worsened. The war on land was costly and unresolved. German leaders understood that unrestricted submarine warfare might bring the United States into the conflict, but they also believed it might cut Britain's lifeline before America could matter militarily. This calculation would become decisive in early 1917, but its roots lay in the same supply system Morgan had helped sustain. American goods flowing to Britain and France were not a side issue. They were one reason Germany felt pressure to strike at shipping more aggressively. The stronger the Atlantic supply line became, the more tempting and necessary it appeared to attack it. That is where the banker's neutrality finally meets the strategist's desperation. Morgan helped finance and organise goods moving across the Atlantic. Britain depended on those goods. Germany sought to break the flow. The United States claimed the right to keep trading and travelling. Submarines made that claim dangerous. Each piece pushed against the others. The result was not a single conspiracy but a tightening knot. Pull on any strand and the whole knot moved. Loans, ships, wheat, shells, diplomatic notes, passenger deaths, investor confidence, blockade policy, submarine orders, election slogans and public anger all belonged to the same tangled rope. There is a moment in this story that is easy to overlook because it is not dramatic in the usual way. It is the moment when the Allies' debt becomes large enough that their defeat becomes almost unthinkable for the American financial establishment. Not impossible, because anything can happen in war, but unthinkable in the sense that too many plans, expectations and interests depend on the opposite outcome. When that happens, neutrality of feeling becomes nearly impossible. A banker may still perform calculations. He may still speak of legality. He may still insist that the firm is only doing business. But emotionally and structurally, the choice has already hardened. The House of Morgan needed the Allies to win, not only because its partners preferred them, but because the firm had helped build an American financial world in which Allied victory protected the value of what had been created. This does not mean Morgan wanted American boys to die in France so his loans would be repaid. That is too crude, and crude explanations often prevent us from seeing the more unsettling truth. The truth is that large systems can align interests in ways that make terrible outcomes seem reasonable, necessary, or unavoidable to the people inside them. A banker can support policies that increase the chance of war while sincerely believing he is defending law, commerce, and civilization. A president can defend neutral rights while moving closer to conflict. A factory owner can make shells while saying he is only filling legal orders. A citizen can buy a bond while believing he is making a safe investment. No one person needs to intend the whole result. The result emerges from many smaller intentions that point the same way. Public resentment toward Morgan was sharpened by the older American fear of the money power. This fear had deep roots. It reached back to battles over the Bank of the United States, to populist attacks on Eastern finance, to anger over railroad rates, gold policy, trusts, and the panic of 1907. The House of Morgan did not enter the war debate as an ordinary business. It entered already carrying decades of symbolic weight. To its enemies, Morgan represented concentrated wealth operating behind closed doors. So when the firm became the Allies' banker, it confirmed what they already feared. Wall Street, they believed, had its own foreign policy. Wall Street had chosen Britain. Wall Street would make the country pay the bill. There were anti-war voices who pushed for an embargo on arms sales. They argued that if America truly wanted peace, it should not allow its factories to feed the slaughter. Others replied that an embargo would help Germany because Britain and France depended more on American imports, while Germany was cut off by blockade. That argument exposed the entire problem. A formally equal rule could have unequal effects because the circumstances were unequal. Neutrality, once placed inside real war conditions, became almost impossible to make both legally consistent and politically satisfying. Morgan benefited from the position the administration chose, but the administration did not choose it only for Morgan. It chose it because American commerce, law, Allied sympathy, and strategic calculation all pulled in that direction. By late 1916, the House of Morgan had become more than an intermediary. It was a symbol of America's half-in, half-out relationship with the war. When Allied fortunes looked uncertain, attention turned to whether they could keep borrowing. When submarine warfare threatened shipping, attention turned to the cargoes and credits that might be lost. When critics warned of entanglement, Morgan was the name they used. The firm's partners could object that they were being made into a scapegoat for forces larger than themselves, and they would have had a point. But symbols matter because they simplify reality enough for public anger to grasp it. Morgan was the door through which much of the Allied war economy entered America, so people gathered their arguments at that door. Then came the beginning of 1917, and the fragile arrangement finally began to break. Germany announced a return to unrestricted submarine warfare, gambling that it could bring Britain to its knees before the United States could intervene effectively. The decision changed everything. It turned the Atlantic supply line from a contested space into the centre of a direct challenge to American rights and power. Ships would be sunk. Neutrality would be tested beyond words. The same ocean that had carried Morgan-financed goods to the Allies now carried the crisis that would push America toward war. Around the same time, the Zimmermann telegram revealed Germany's proposal that Mexico join a war against the United States if America entered the conflict, with promises regarding lost territories. To many Americans, this confirmed that Germany was not merely fighting Britain, but threatening the United States itself. At that point, Morgan no longer needed to persuade the country by himself, and perhaps he never could have. Events were doing the persuading. German policy had handed Wilson the argument that neutrality could not protect American rights. But when America moved toward war, it did so after years of economic preparation that had tied it to the Allied cause. The Morgan loans, the purchasing system, the exports, the shipping conflicts, the investor stakes, all of these formed the background against which the final crisis occurred. They did not replace the submarine issue or the Zimmermann telegram. They made the direction of American movement more comprehensible. When the break came, America did not turn toward a stranger. It turned toward governments it had already been feeding, financing, and supplying. For Jack Morgan, the shift from neutral banker to banker of a nation at war would change the role again. Before April 1917, his firm had operated in the grey space between private commerce and foreign policy. After American entry, the United States government itself would step forward as the great lender and organiser. The private empire Morgan had built around Allied finance would not disappear, but it would be absorbed into a larger public war effort. The banker who could not stay neutral would find that his country could not stay neutral either. And when that happened, the question would no longer be whether Morgan's loans compromised neutrality. The question would be how a private financial system that had helped sustain Britain and France before American entry would adapt when the full power of the United States Treasury entered the war and began doing, openly and officially, what private finance had been doing in partial shadow for years. By the spring of 1917, the long argument over neutrality had worn thin. For nearly 3 years, America had tried to stand outside the war while money, goods, ships, anger and fear kept pulling it closer. The country had spoken the language of peace while its factories filled orders for war. It had defended the rights of neutral commerce while that commerce flowed overwhelmingly toward Britain and France. It had watched German submarines challenge the Atlantic routes on which those exports depended. It had watched the Allied governments borrow, buy and depend more heavily on American resources with every passing month. Then Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare, and the sea became not just a place of risk, but a direct challenge to American authority. The Zimmermann telegram followed soon after, with its proposal that Mexico join Germany in the event of war with the United States. By then, the question was no longer whether America could remain untouched. It was whether the country could admit how deeply it had already been touched. On April 2nd, 1917, Woodrow Wilson went before Congress and asked for a declaration of war against Germany. His speech did not sound like a banker's memorandum. It did not speak the language of bonds, munitions contracts, shipping insurance, foreign exchange, or unpaid Allied invoices. Wilson spoke of rights, law, humanity, democracy, and the need to make the world safe for democratic nations. He framed the decision in moral terms, as presidents almost always must when asking citizens to accept war. A government cannot tell families that their sons are needed to protect a portfolio. It must speak of principles large enough to carry grief, and many of Wilson's principles were sincerely held. German submarine warfare had killed civilians and threatened American shipping. The Zimmermann telegram had enraged the public. The German autocracy seemed to many Americans like a genuine danger to international order. But beneath the moral language lay 3 years of material preparation. America was not entering a war with strangers. It was entering on the side of governments it had already supplied, financed, and emotionally moved toward. This is where the House of Morgan's position changed in a way that was both dramatic and almost anticlimactic. Before American entry, Morgan's power had rested partly on the strange gap between private action and public neutrality. The firm had arranged loans, coordinated purchases, and helped the Allies draw on American industry, while the United States government remained officially outside the war. That grey area had made Morgan unusually important. The bank could do things the government was not yet ready to do openly. It could connect Allied need with American money and goods in ways that remained legally private, even if they had obvious public consequences. Once America entered the war, that grey area did not disappear at once, but it began to shrink. The United States Treasury stepped forward. The federal government became the great lender. Washington began to organize production, shipping, food, fuel, labor, and finance on a scale that even the House of Morgan could not match. The private empire did not so much vanish as become absorbed into the official war machine. Think about that transition for a moment, because it is one of the most revealing parts of the story. For years, critics had warned that Morgan was doing privately what the country might later be forced to do publicly. After April 1917, that warning began to look less like paranoia and more like prophecy. The United States government now loaned money directly to the Allies. It raised enormous sums from American citizens through Liberty loans. It coordinated industry through new federal boards and agencies. It regulated priorities for materials and transportation. It tried to decide what should be built first, what should be shipped first, who should receive steel, fuel, rails, ships, and credit. The machinery that Morgan had helped build for Britain and France did not become irrelevant. It became part of a larger system, one with flags, laws, public bond drives, cabinet officers, and patriotic posters. The money question was immediate. War required spending at a scale the United States had never faced before. Soldiers had to be recruited, trained, clothed, armed, transported, fed, and eventually sent across the Atlantic. Camps had to be built, ships had to be acquired or constructed, factories had to expand, railroads had to carry impossible volumes of freight, the Navy had to protect sea lanes. The Allies still needed support, because America's army would not appear in France overnight. Britain and France had been fighting since 1914. They were exhausted, indebted, and still in desperate need of American credit. Now the source of that credit shifted. Instead of relying primarily on private loans arranged by Morgan, the Allies increasingly borrowed from the United States government itself. The lender became public. The scale became national. Secretary of the Treasury William Gibbs McAdoo became one of the central figures in this new financial order. He had to do what Morgan had done in private, but for the entire country, and with the legitimacy of the federal government behind him. He had to persuade Americans to lend their savings to the war effort. The Liberty loan campaigns turned finance into a public ritual. Bonds were no longer simply securities sold through private networks to investors who understood yield and risk. They became patriotic objects. Posters urged Americans to buy. Movie stars, speakers, bankers, ministers, teachers, and local committees encouraged subscription. Parades and rallies helped transform lending into citizenship. A person who bought a Liberty bond could feel that he or she had done something for the soldiers, something for the flag, something for democracy. The same act that a banker might describe as purchasing government debt became, in public language, a moral duty. This was a remarkable transformation. Before American entry, the purchase of Allied bonds could be controversial because it seemed to compromise neutrality. After American entry, the purchase of American war bonds became proof of loyalty. The financial act did not change as much as the political meaning around it changed. A bond was still a promise, still a claim on future payment, still a mechanism for turning private savings into public spending. But now the nation itself wrapped that mechanism in ceremony. It asked schoolchildren to save pennies. It asked workers to set aside wages. It asked immigrants to prove devotion. It asked the wealthy to subscribe publicly and generously. It asked communities to meet quotas as if buying bonds were a local battle to be won. Finance came out of Morgan's private offices and walked into the streets wearing a flag. The House of Morgan remained involved, of course. It would have been impossible to exclude such a firm from the financial work of the war entirely, and no serious official would have wanted to waste its expertise. Morgan Partners and Associates had experience in foreign exchange, securities distribution, allied purchasing, and large-scale credit. They knew the same people in London and Paris that the Treasury now had to deal with directly. They understood how American investors thought. They understood the supply chains already created. But their role had changed. They were no longer the central private gate through which Allied borrowing had to pass. The United States government had become the gate. That did not make Morgan powerless. It made Morgan one powerful piece inside a larger public machine. There was a quiet irony in this. The progressive era had spent years worrying that private bankers had too much power over public life. The war then forced the federal government to build capacities that reduced some of that private dominance by taking over functions only the largest financial houses had previously been able to manage. Yet it did so by borrowing many of the habits, people, and relationships of the private system. Public power did not emerge from nowhere. It learned from Wall Street even as it tried to outrank it. The state needed men who knew how to raise money, place securities, coordinate industry, and manage enormous contracts. Some of those men came from the very financial world reformers distrusted. War often does that. It takes the people and systems a country already has, then expands them under emergency pressure. Edward Stettinius Sr. is a useful figure here because his career shows how the Morgan purchasing world flowed into official war administration. He had helped run the firm's massive Allied purchasing operation. After American entry, men with that kind of practical knowledge became valuable to Washington. The government needed expertise in procurement, industrial capacity, and the movement of supplies. It needed people who knew how to translate military need into contracts and production. A man who had helped coordinate Allied purchases for Morgan understood the terrain. The boundary between private service to the Allies and public service to the United States became thin because the problems were similar, only larger and now official. What had once been done for foreign clients through private channels was now done for the American war effort under public authority. The War Industries Board, which grew in importance as the war continued and came under the leadership of Bernard Baruch in 1918, represented another part of this shift. The board tried to impose order on production, priorities, and raw materials. It did not run the American economy in the fully centralized way some later wartime agencies would, but it marked a major expansion of federal involvement. Steel, copper, rubber, chemicals, fuel, transportation, and factory capacity all had to be allocated among competing needs. The Allies still needed supplies. The American army now needed supplies too. Civilian industries needed materials to keep ordinary life functioning. Someone had to decide what came first. The old Morgan skill of imposing order on disorder had become, in a broader form, a federal task. The shipping problem became even more urgent after American entry. It was one thing to finance and produce goods. It was another to move an army across the Atlantic while also carrying food, munitions, raw materials, and civilian necessities. German submarines threatened the sea lanes. The United States had to expand shipbuilding, coordinate convoy systems with the British, and protect vessels carrying men and supplies. The ocean, which had been the corridor of Morgan-financed commerce, became the road to American military participation. Every transport ship represented a public commitment far beyond private trade. Every convoy carried the proof that the United States was no longer merely supplying war. It was sending its own people into it. For Britain and France, American entry brought relief, but not instant rescue. This is important to understand. The declaration of war did not place a large trained American army in the trenches the next morning. The United States had to build an army suitable for European war almost from scratch. General John J. Pershing and the American Expeditionary Forces would take time to arrive in strength. In the meantime, the Allies still needed money and supplies. The United States Treasury's loans helped stabilize their position. American resources continued to flow. The difference was that now the flow came under the authority of an ally, not merely a neutral supplier. The psychological effect mattered. Britain and France knew that the American state, not just American markets, had entered the struggle. Germany knew it too, though German leaders hoped the submarine campaign could still produce victory before American power fully arrived. For Morgan, this was both vindication and diminishment. Vindication because the side the firm had backed was now the side the United States officially joined. The years of Allied loans and purchases no longer looked to supporters like dangerous partiality. They looked like foresight. Morgan could be cast as the institution that had helped keep Britain and France alive until America recognised where its true interest lay. But it was also diminishment because the firm's unique role was reduced. When the government becomes the principal lender, the private banker's centrality declines. The House of Morgan had been indispensable in the shadow period before American entry. Once Washington took the lead, Morgan became important rather than singular. That is a real change. The old critics did not disappear. They could still argue that the country had been pulled into war after years of financial entanglement. In their view, American entry confirmed the danger they had warned about all along. The banker loans, the munitions orders, the Allied debts, the shipping disputes, all had created a path that made war more likely. The supporters replied that Germany had forced the issue through unrestricted submarine warfare and hostile plotting, and that the United States had entered for reasons far larger than Morgan's balance sheet. Again, both sides were touching part of the truth. German actions were decisive in the final move toward war. But the country that responded to those actions was not economically untouched. It had already been drawn toward the Allies by years of trade, loans, and sympathy. The final spark fell on ground that had been prepared. The Liberty loan drives also changed the social scale of war finance. Under Morgan, Allied financing had been concentrated among banks, investors, and large financial networks. Under the Treasury, the federal government tried to democratize borrowing, or at least to make it appear democratic. Millions of Americans bought bonds in varying amounts. Some bought large subscriptions. Others bought small ones through installment plans or saving stamps. The act of lending to the government became a shared national experience. That did not mean the burden was equal. Wealthier Americans had far greater capacity to buy. But the language of the campaigns invited everyone to participate. It turned war finance into a test of belonging. To refuse could be seen as disloyal, especially in communities where pressure was intense. This public pressure could become harsh. The same bond rallies that produced patriotic unity could also produce suspicion toward those who did not or could not buy. German Americans, pacifists, socialists, immigrants and dissenters often faced scrutiny. War finance became part of the machinery of conformity. A Liberty bond was not only an investment, it was a visible sign that one stood with the nation. In that sense, The public war finance system had a moral pressure Morgan's private system never possessed in the same way. Morgan could persuade investors. The government could summon citizens. That difference matters. Private finance operates through opportunity and confidence. Public war finance operates through opportunity, confidence, duty, fear, and social pressure all at once. The federal government also began lending to the Allies in ways that dwarfed earlier private loans. These inter-allied credits eventually reached billions of dollars. The United States did not simply fight alongside Britain and France, it financed them. This is one of the great facts of American entry. The country brought manpower, yes, and eventually that manpower mattered deeply. But it also brought credit backed by the enormous taxing and borrowing power of the United States. The Allies needed that backing. Their financial exhaustion was real. The Treasury's loans allowed them to continue buying in the American market and helped stabilize exchange. The banker of the Allies, in effect, became the American government. Morgan had shown the road. The state widened it. There is a deeper transformation here, one that goes beyond the war itself. Before 1914, the United States was rising economically, but had not yet fully assumed the role of global creditor and financial centre. The war accelerated that change. Gold had flowed to America, Allied debts accumulated. New York gained stature. The federal government developed tools for mass borrowing and international lending. American citizens became accustomed to buying federal securities in enormous campaigns. The relationship between Wall Street and Washington changed. The war did not create American financial power from nothing, but it forced that power into a new shape. Morgan's pre-war and early war role belongs to this transition. It was the bridge between older private transatlantic banking and the newer public financial power of the United States. Inside the Morgan firm, the shift must have felt complex. The partners had worked for years under pressure, criticism, and enormous responsibility. They had built purchasing channels, arranged loans, and managed relationships with governments fighting for survival. Then the American state, whose neutrality had once constrained everything, entered the war and took command of the larger financial mission. Some of the firm's work continued, some was redirected. Some of its people entered public service, some of its influence became less visible, but remained important through advice, relationships, and expertise. Powerful institutions rarely lose influence simply because a new authority appears. They adapt. They move into committees, advisory roles, syndicates, and informal channels. The House of Morgan knew how to do that. The public, meanwhile, saw a simpler picture. America was at war. The flag was raised. The enemy was named. Men registered for the draft. Troops trained. Posters appeared. Bonds were sold. Factories roared. Ships crossed. The complexity of the neutral years began to fade behind the clarity that war demands. Once a nation enters a conflict, it often rewrites the road that led there in simpler terms. Hesitation becomes patience. Entanglement becomes preparation. Profit becomes service. Doubt becomes lack of faith. This is not always deliberate deception. It is how societies make war bearable. They need the story to become cleaner than the experience was. Morgan benefited from that cleaning in some circles and remained condemned in others. To admirers, the firm had helped the Allies survive. To enemies, it had helped make American neutrality impossible. Wilson himself now faced the problem of turning moral entry into practical war. Declaring that the world must be made safe for democracy did not produce rifles, ships, trained divisions, or artillery shells. The government had to mobilize a society unused to modern total war. It had to raise taxes and borrow massively. It had to regulate food and fuel. It had to manage railroads, encourage production, and suppress dissent. It had to turn a diverse, often divided population into a wartime public. The tools of finance were central to that effort. Without money, no plan could move. Without credit, no army could be sustained. The idealistic language of the war rested on bond sales, tax bills, and appropriations. Even the most moral war aim required bookkeeping. That is one of the sober lessons of this story. Every grand phrase has an invoice behind it. Democracy, civilization, freedom of the seas, national honour. These words mattered, but they did not float above the world. They had to be carried by ships, fed by farmers, armed by factories, financed by bonds, and administered by people who knew how to move resources. The House of Morgan had understood the invoice before the country accepted the cause. Washington now had to write the invoice in the name of the people. The private machinery had become public, but the underlying truth remained the same. Modern war is a contest of finance and organisation as much as courage. American soldiers began crossing the Atlantic in growing numbers, though the great impact of the American expeditionary forces would come later. Their movement gave a human face to what had previously been, for many Americans, an economic and diplomatic war. Now families watched sons leave, training camps filled, uniforms appeared in towns, casualty lists would follow, the bond drives and purchasing systems, the loans and export figures, all now connected to American lives directly. Before, a shell made in America might be fired by a British or French gun crew. Now American soldiers themselves would depend on the same industrial and financial systems. The war was no longer something America supplied from a distance. It was something America had to survive from within. For Britain and France, American public finance was a lifeline. For Germany, it was a worsening clock. The gamble of unrestricted submarine warfare had been that Britain could be starved or forced toward collapse before America's weight arrived. Every Liberty loan, every Treasury credit, every convoy, every training camp, every shipyard expansion suggested that the gamble might fail if time ran long enough. The war had become a race between destruction and mobilization. Morgan's earlier work had helped keep the Allies in the race before America entered. After April 1917, the United States government began running beside them openly. And yet the old Morgan question remained under the surface. When private finance helps prepare the path to public war, how should history judge it? Not with a single word. Not only as greed, not only as foresight, not only as patriotism, not only as manipulation. The House of Morgan operated in the world as it existed. Legal neutral trade, British sea power, Allied need, American industrial capacity, investor appetite, German submarine warfare, and the cultural sympathies of an Eastern financial elite. It made choices inside that world, and those choices had consequences. After American entry, some consequences were absorbed into the official national story. Others would return later in bitterness, especially after the war ended, and Americans asked what had been gained for the blood and money spent. By late 1917 and into 1918, the financial centre of gravity had clearly shifted toward Washington. The Treasury's borrowing campaigns reached into nearly every corner of American life. The federal government's loans to the Allies surpassed anything private bankers could have sustained alone. War agencies multiplied. Industrial mobilization expanded. The House of Morgan remained influential, but the age in which a single private bank could act almost as the Allies' chief American financial engine had passed into something larger. The private empire had become official, and in becoming official it no longer belonged only to Morgan. It belonged to the state, to the taxpayers, to bondholders, to soldiers, to families, and to the future political arguments that debt always leaves behind. That last point matters because borrowing does not end when the guns stop. A loan has memory. It survives speeches, parades, victories, funerals, and elections. The money raised in Liberty loan campaigns would have to be serviced. The Allied debts to the United States would become a source of post-war tension. The profits earned by bankers and manufacturers would become evidence in later accusations. The question of whether America had entered the war for democracy or for dollars would not disappear simply because Wilson gave noble reasons. It would linger, sharpen, and return in the 1920s and 1930s as the country grew disillusioned. Morgan's wartime role would be re-examined not only in light of victory, but in light of disappointment. For the moment, though, in the final stretch of the war, the machine kept moving. Bonds were sold, Treasury credits flowed, Allied purchases continued, American troops crossed the Atlantic, ships travelled in convoy, factories produced, farms supplied. The same channels that had once carried the ambiguous commerce of neutrality now carried the declared effort of a nation at war. The House of Morgan had helped build those channels before the flag was officially committed. Now the flag moved through them, and as the war pushed toward its last terrible year, the question waiting ahead was not whether Morgan had become the banker of the Allies. That had already happened. The deeper question was what price came with that achievement. For the firm, for American neutrality, for the reputation of Wall Street, for the post-war debt system, and for a country that would soon look back and wonder whether the road to war had been paved with principles, profits, or some uneasy mixture of both. When the armistice came on November 11th, 1918, the guns stopped before the bills did. That is one of the things war always hides from the people waiting for peace. The moment the shooting ends feels, from a distance, like an ending. Church bells ring, crowds gather, flags appear in windows, soldiers who have survived begin to imagine home. Families who have waited for letters begin to breathe differently. Newspapers print words like victory and peace and end. But money does not obey the emotional rhythm of an armistice. Debt does not stop at 11 o'clock in the morning. Contracts do not dissolve because men stop firing. Bonds still have interest dates. Governments still have obligations. Factories still have accounts to settle. Ships still carry cargo. Families still count the dead. And in the offices of the House of Morgan, where the war had been measured for years in loans, purchases, cables, commissions, securities and risk, the end of the fighting did not erase the question that had been building since 1914. What did it cost to become the banker of World War I? For Britain and France, the price was visible in ruined towns, wounded men, fatherless children, drained treasuries, and a dependence on American money that would shape the post-war world. For the United States, the price was stranger. America emerged from the war more powerful, richer in global claims, and closer to the centre of world finance than it had ever been before. New York had risen. Washington had learned how to borrow on a massive scale. American factories had expanded. American farms had fed armies and civilians across the ocean. American banks had helped transform the country from a borrower into a creditor. On paper, this looked like triumph. In ledgers, it often looked like success. But history is rarely satisfied with paper. The same process that made America financially stronger also left Americans asking whether they had been drawn into the war by ideals, by necessity, by German provocation, by Allied sympathy, by Wall Street, or by some mixture so tangled that no one could pull the strands apart cleanly. The House of Morgan stood at the centre of that argument, because the firm had been too important to be forgotten and too profitable to be forgiven easily. Before America entered the war, Morgan had arranged Allied loans, managed purchasing, helped coordinate the flow of American goods to Britain and France, and earned commissions from a system that turned neutral American production into Allied endurance. After America entered, Washington took over the largest financial role, but Morgan's earlier position remained part of the story. To supporters, the firm had performed a necessary service. It had helped Britain and France survive the years when America was not yet ready to fight. It had organised chaos, created confidence, and connected Allied need to American abundance. To critics, the same record looked like an indictment. Morgan had profited while Europe burned. Morgan had tied American money to Allied victory. Morgan had helped make neutrality impossible. Morgan had stood at the counter of the world's largest storehouse and charged a fee while the shelves emptied into war. There is no honest way to reduce this to one sentence. That is what makes it worth staying with a little longer. The House of Morgan did not cause World War I. The war began from European rivalries, alliances, militarism, imperial fears, nationalism, and decisions made by governments far from Wall Street. Jack Morgan did not order German armies through Belgium. He did not command submarines. He did not send the Zimmermann telegram. He did not make Wilson ask Congress for war. But it is also not true that Morgan's role was incidental, as if the firm had merely handled paperwork in the corner while history happened elsewhere. Modern war cannot be separated from money. If a bank helps finance supplies without which armies cannot continue, that bank belongs inside the story. It may not be the author of the war, but it is one of the hands keeping the war supplied with ink. The immediate financial result for Morgan was enormous influence and enormous criticism. The firm had made money. The commissions from Allied purchasing were large. Its role in loans brought fees, prestige, and connections. Its partners had been in constant contact with Allied officials and American policymakers. Morgan had become a private bridge between governments, and bridges of that kind are never neutral objects. They decide what can pass easily and what cannot. The firm's defenders could point to the scale of the work, the complexity, the risk, the need for coordination, and the fact that the Allies genuinely required American support. All of that is true. But critics could point to the visible profits and say that necessity had been very good business. That was true too. After the war, the question of Allied debts became one of the great irritations of international politics. Britain and France had borrowed heavily, first through private channels and later from the American government. They had also lent to their own allies, fought for years, suffered staggering human losses, and expected that the peace settlement might make Germany pay reparations large enough to help balance the accounts. The United States, having entered late and emerged financially strengthened, expected debts to be repaid. This created bitterness. Europeans often felt that America had profited from the war and now wanted repayment from countries that had done most of the bleeding. Americans often felt that debts were debts, and that European governments were trying to avoid obligations freely undertaken. No one's memory was entirely fair. Everyone counted sacrifice in the units most familiar to them. Britain and France counted graves, devastation, and exhaustion. America counted loans, bonds, and public money advanced to allies who had promised repayment. Morgan's earlier private loans became part of this broader atmosphere, even when the largest post-war disputes involved government debts. The firm had helped open the road to American lending. It had shown that Allied credit could be marketed in the United States. It had helped create the habit of seeing Britain and France not only as belligerents, but as borrowers tied to American confidence. Once the federal government took over, the scale changed, but the logic continued. America financed the Allies because the Allies needed financing, and because America had become capable of providing it. When peace came, that capability became leverage, and leverage rarely produces affection. The war also altered the relationship between Wall Street and Washington. Before 1914, the House of Morgan had represented an older world of private financial authority, the kind that had rescued the Treasury in 1895 and helped stop the panic of 1907. During the neutral years, it had operated in that older mode again, using private networks to manage international problems faster than the government could or would. But once America entered the war, the federal government demonstrated that it could raise money on a scale no private house could match. The Liberty loans reached millions of citizens. The Treasury became the great organizer of war finance. Federal agencies pushed into production, transportation, food, fuel, and shipping. This did not destroy Morgan power, but it changed the world around it. The old private empire had helped prepare the road. The state then paved it, widened it, and claimed it as a public highway. There is a quiet humiliation in that, though not one anyone at Morgan would have spoken of that way. The firm had been indispensable when America was neutral. It had been the channel because the state would not yet openly become the channel. But when the state decided to act, the scale of public power surpassed the private bank. Morgan remained elite, influential, wealthy, and connected. But it was no longer the only great answer to emergency. The war confirmed both the usefulness and the limits of private finance. A banking house could connect nations, it could organise confidence, it could move credit. But a modern total war required taxation, mass borrowing, conscription, regulation, propaganda, and public authority. The banker could open the gate, only the state could send a nation through it. For Jack Morgan himself, the post-war years brought neither simple disgrace nor simple vindication. He remained one of the most important financiers in the world. The House of Morgan continued to operate at the highest levels of international banking. Yet the war left a stain in the minds of many Americans who believed Wall Street had profited from destruction. This suspicion deepened as the bright promises of 1917 and 1918 began to fade. Wilson's dream of a new international order broke against political resistance at home and resentment abroad. The United States never joined the League of Nations. Europe remained unstable. Reparations, debts, inflation, nationalism and grief all poisoned the peace. In that darker post-war atmosphere, people began to look backward with colder eyes. The old wartime language of democracy and civilization no longer satisfied everyone. Some asked whether the war had been worth it. Others asked who had benefited. And when Americans ask who benefited from a war, the trail often leads them back to banks. By the 1930s, this suspicion became formal and public through investigations into the role of bankers and arms manufacturers in the war. The Senate committee led by Gerald Nye gave national attention to the idea that munitions makers and financiers, later remembered under the phrase merchants of death, had helped push America into World War I. The committee did not prove a simple conspiracy, because the history was never that simple. But it did give voice to a powerful disillusionment. Many Americans in the interwar years wanted to believe that they had been tricked, not because that explanation captured everything, but because it made the pain of the war easier to place. If bankers and arms dealers had pulled the country into Europe's catastrophe, then the lesson was clear. Keep away from them. Keep away from foreign loans, keep away from entanglements, keep American boys at home. The memory of Morgan's Allied loans fed directly into that mood. This is one of the long prices Morgan paid. Not bankruptcy, not ruin, not imprisonment. The price was reputation, or more precisely, the permanent division of reputation. The House of Morgan could be admired as brilliant, efficient, and central to Allied survival. It could also be condemned as proof that private finance could entangle a democracy before its citizens understood what had happened. The firm became part of a warning story. Whenever Americans later debated neutrality, arms sales, foreign loans, or aid to nations at war, the memory of 1914 to 1917 hovered nearby. People remembered that money and material can move before soldiers do. They remembered that economic alignment can precede political commitment. They remembered, or thought they remembered, that bankers had once made war profitable. For Britain and France, the price of relying on Morgan, and then Washington, was dependency. Their victory did not free them from American financial power. In some ways, it deepened it. Britain had entered the war as the centre of global finance, the great creditor empire with London at the heart of international money. It emerged victorious but weakened. The United States emerged as the great creditor, holding claims that would shape the 1920s. This change did not happen only because of Morgan, but Morgan's wartime role belongs to the larger shift. The old world in which London stood at the centre, and New York looked across the Atlantic for approval, had begun to pass. The war moved gold, debt, and confidence westward. The House of Morgan helped manage that movement before anyone fully understood its consequences. There is something almost ironic in the fact that Morgan's pro-Allied work strengthened the United States, even as it helped weaken the old European order the firm culturally admired. The Morgan world had deep affection for Britain, for European finance, for the habits and manners of the Atlantic elite. Yet the war it helped finance accelerated the transfer of power away from Europe and toward America. Britain survived, but at immense cost. France survived, but deeply wounded. Germany was defeated but not reconciled. The United States became stronger, but also more ambivalent about its own power. Morgan helped sustain the Allies and helped usher in a world where American money could no longer pretend to be secondary. The human price, of course, was far larger than any banking story can hold. Millions dead, millions wounded, villages emptied, bodies buried under names and under no names, men returning with lungs damaged by gas, faces broken by shells, minds permanently altered by things no one yet knew how to name properly, families waiting for someone who would never come home, children growing up in the shadow of absence. It is important to say this in a story about finance because money can make war seem cleaner than it is. A bond has no mud on it. A loan agreement does not scream. A purchasing contract does not show you a field after artillery fire. But all of those documents belong to the same world as the mud and the screams. They did not cause every death. They did not pull every trigger. But they helped sustain the system in which the killing continued. This does not mean the Allies should have been left without supplies. It does not mean German victory would have been better. It does not mean neutrality was morally pure or practically possible. It means only that war finance should never be allowed to hide behind its own neatness. The office and the battlefield are not separate worlds in modern war. They are connected by lines of money, supply, need, and command. The House of Morgan story forces us to look at those lines without flinching. It asks us to understand that a banker can be far from the front and still be part of the war. It asks us to understand that a factory worker, a farmer, an investor, a shipper, and a cabinet official can all be connected to the same conflict in different degrees and with different levels of awareness. It asks us to understand that neutrality is not only a legal status but a material condition. And once the material condition changes, the legal status begins to sound thin. By the end of the war, Jack Morgan had become something his father never had the chance to become, the banker most closely associated with the greatest war the world had yet seen. The old J.P. Morgan had rescued markets, reorganized railroads, built trusts, and imposed order in moments of panic. His son inherited the name and found himself using it in an emergency that dwarfed the old crises. But the son's achievement was different from the father's. The father had often acted like a private central bank inside a still developing American financial system. The son acted like a private foreign office of credit during the neutral years of a world war. Both roles were powerful, both were controversial, both revealed gaps in public authority that private finance stepped in to fill, and that may be the clearest lesson of all. Morgan became the banker of World War I because the war arrived at a moment when the United States had enormous productive capacity, deepening financial strength, and a government not yet ready to use that strength openly. Into that gap stepped a private institution with the right name, the right connections, the right confidence, and the right sympathies. Britain and France needed someone in America who could make the market work for them. Morgan could. American manufacturers needed assurance that Allied orders were real. Morgan could provide it. Investors needed confidence that Allied bonds were worth buying. Morgan could lend its name. Washington needed commerce to continue without declaring war too soon. Morgan's private machinery made that possible, at least for a while. The firm became indispensable because the situation rewarded exactly the kind of power it possessed. But indispensability is not innocence. That is where the story refuses to settle comfortably. Morgan's work helped the Allies survive. It helped American industry grow. It helped shift the financial center of gravity toward New York. It helped prepare the United States for the role it would later play in the world. It also made neutrality less real, tied private profit to public danger, and gave future generations a reason to worry about the influence of banks and arms suppliers in foreign policy. The price of becoming the banker of World War I was not a single bill paid once. It was a debt of memory, suspicion and power that continued long after the armistice. If you want to feel the whole story in one image, do not picture only the Morgan office, and do not picture only the trench. Picture a line running between them. At one end, a polished desk in New York with cables from London, figures in columns, bond terms, shipping reports, and men deciding how much credit can be extended. At the other end, a muddy position in France where soldiers wait for shells, food, boots, wire, and orders. Between those 2 points are factories, farms, railroads, ports, ships, submarines, insurers, investors, diplomats, newspapers, and families. That line is modern war. It is long, complicated, and easy to ignore because no one person can see all of it at once. Morgan's importance was that his firm stood on that line and helped keep it open. The old man of Wall Street had built a name that meant order in a crisis. His son used that name in a crisis so large that order itself became a kind of weapon. Gold crossed the Atlantic. Loans followed. Shells, wheat, horses, steel, and ships moved through the channels of credit. A neutral country became an arsenal and then an ally. A private bank became an unofficial storekeeper and then watched the government turn its private machinery into public war finance. When peace came, the profits remained, the debts remained, the power remained, and so did the doubts. And maybe that is why this story still matters, not because J.P. Morgan was uniquely evil or uniquely noble, not because bankers alone decide wars. They do not. But because the story shows how quietly a nation can become involved before it says the word war out loud. It shows how money can move first, how supply can move first, how sympathy can become credit, how credit can become dependency, and how dependency can become policy. It reminds us that the road to war is not always lined with drums and speeches. Sometimes it is lined with invoices, bond circulars, shipping manifests, factory orders, and respectable men explaining that everything is perfectly legal. So when we say that J.P. Morgan became the banker of World War I, we should hear both the scale and the warning inside the phrase. It means the House of Morgan helped finance the survival of Britain and France before America entered the war. It means a private American firm stood at the centre of Allied purchasing and credit when the United States was still officially neutral. It means Wall Street became part of the battlefield long before American soldiers reached the trenches. And it means that after the shooting stopped, people looked back at that quiet machinery and wondered whether the price had been paid only in interest or in something much harder to measure. Trust, neutrality, innocence, the belief that a country can sell, lend, profit, and still remain untouched by the war it is helping to feed.